to the Russell Scott Show.
Dr. Walt Brown, welcome to the program.
Oh, good afternoon.
Dr. Walt Brown is the world's foremost expert in JFK research. He is the author of 6 books on the subject, including Treachery in Dallas and The War on a Mission. He has worked as a special agent for the Justice Department, has a PhD in history, and is currently working on his 30,000-plus page chronology of the JFK assassination. He's also my good friend, and it's an honor to have him here on the show. Walt, where were you on the day Kennedy was shot?
Amazingly enough, I was a junior in high school, and we were on split sessions. So we were dismissed to go home Eastern Standard Time just as Kennedy's plane was leaving Fort Worth to go to Love Field. Amazingly enough, I got home in the house I still live in, and I frittered around. We didn't have any sports practice until the second session got out, and I was walking into town, and a woman just came over to me and told me, "Did you hear the president's been shot? She was shot in the head and doesn't look good." And in that minute, it was over. There was no waiting. There was no worrying. There was no nail biting. It was just a done deal. And I walked into the block, and there was a TV set in the window of a store, and Walter Cronkite was, making it official, which always to me made it sound like it was a new record in the long jump. And the last class I had, while John Kennedy was president, was English 3, and 37 years later, somebody I knew the English teacher I had, and I said, "Please, when you get a chance, say hello for me." So she did. And the guy said, "What's he up to?" She goes, "Oh, he's written, 9 or 14 books or something like that." The English teacher said, "I never thought he'd read 9 books," which is a heck of a recommendation. But I sent him a copy of one of the books, and he read it very carefully, and he graded it just the way he always graded things, and he was very pleased with it. But that was just a cold, gray afternoon in New Jersey. And when I've given talks back in the day when you were talking to people that remembered, 20 years ago, how many of you remember where you were when Kennedy was shot? And the audience all puts their hands up. And then the next question I said to them, how many of you remember where you were when you heard about it? And then they realized that's what they answered in the first question. Because what they remembered is where they were when they heard about it, not where they were at 12:30 Eastern Time or 12:30 Central Time, 1:30 Eastern. They wouldn't know. I know because I still live in the same house. And it's in its own way, it's haunting, because I was here when it happened. And the work I've been doing, particularly the last 8 years, you said 31,000 plus now, is just being generated at the same site. But like I said, it was it was like a raw afternoon in New Jersey. And it hadn't been raw until the news came out. And I can still see that woman walking up to me. And I know exactly the spot where it happened. When I can't remember, then I'll know, and I better see the Alzheimer's doctor.
The story obviously starts far before the man was shot and killed.
Oh, absolutely.
So instead of asking you what happened on November 22nd, 1963, you've written this chronology. Let's look at it in a chronological way, and let's tell the story of the JFK assassination.
All right. Well,
by
first of all,
I mean you.
Yeah. Let's just put aside the Lee Oswald did it stuff, because there's more holes in that than there are anywhere else. And at the end of the day, part of the proof of what I would talk about is that he didn't do it. Going back to January 20th of 1961, I heard Kennedy's inaugural over the PA system in school. I was in 8th grade at that point. And I had just pulled for Kennedy like crazy. I was up until 5:30 in the morning at age 13 on election night till finally they conceded. And very few people know it, but the real clue that he was elected is when the head of the Secret Service made a phone call to Hyannisport to tell Secret Service agents to go to work, and he made a call to Los Angeles to tell them, Nixon ain't getting a job, you can go home. That was what kind of made it official. And when you look back now on Kennedy, Kennedy's inaugural, it was a little bit militant. I mean, there was a stridency to it, in the sense of, we're not going to take any nonsense from people that decide they're going to be our enemies. But with the passage of time, and with the realization of what was happening, events came along, Kennedy came to realize that things were not as they seemed. One of the people that ran against Kennedy in the primaries was Stuart Symington. He was in the Senate in 1960, openly stating that we have to get going, and we have to get going, because within 1 year the Soviets will have 3,000 ICBMs in place. And Eisenhower, one of his gophers, came in and said, "You know what Symington just said?" So we said, "Well, let's find out." He called, of all people, Allen Dulles, the CIA, and said, "What are your projections for Soviet missile emplacement over the next year?" And Dulles said, "Well, by 1962 they might have a dozen." And Symington is saying 3,000. We were putting one nuclear delivery vehicle on site every day during Kennedy's 1,000 days. Either a Polaris missile submarine would be christened, or the Minutemen missiles were going into the ground. And the Cold War was just an absolute fraud. The Russians had fooled us with the propaganda stunts, putting Yuri Gagarin in space, Sputnik. Their rocketry was essentially a bunch of bombs with tin cans on top, and if the bomb went off, the tin can went up and went into orbit. There was no sophistication whatsoever. And Kennedy learned that. The Russians killed off a number of astronauts before Gagarin finally succeeded. And when it came time for the showdown in Cuba in 1962, again, there was that stridency in Kennedy's voice. But there was a, fear or an anxiety behind it. Because if, in fact, there were actual missiles in Cuba, and who knows, because those parades that used to go through Red Square with rockets, for all we know, they were tin cans. There's no way of knowing. If there were missiles in Cuba, we were in trouble. Because Kennedy knew, and the people that needed to know, knew that the Russians posed no threat to us whatsoever in terms of atomic warfare. None whatsoever. They were so badly outnumbered that it was useless for them to even imagine it. And I think one time when you and I were talking, I told you about what the Russians did at an air show. When they developed the new generation of bombers, they flew two formations over this air show, where, of course, Americans were invited and whatnot. And then those planes landed, and they changed the numbers on them, and they sent them up again. And they landed, and they sent them up again. The American observers sent home, the Russians have suddenly got 500 heavy bombers when they had 20. And then just the numbers are constantly being changed.
Mm-hmm.
And the Russians had no choice, because they didn't have the resources, the economic resources. And ultimately, the Cold War bankrupted the Soviet Union in 1989. It's not a pretty good job to do the same with us. But with the missiles in Cuba, there was the fear that something could go wrong. Something could go seriously wrong. And it almost did, because one U-2 airplane was called back when it was over Soviet airspace during the missile crisis. And of course the Russians would perceive that as a reconnaissance prior to an attack. And just as a coincidence, the second American U-2 that was shot down on November 21st, 1963, the day before the assassination, which allows for the thinking that there were plans for something with regard to Cuba on November 22nd, because they were going to catch a Cuban fanatic as the assassin. But the missile crisis really taught Kennedy a lesson. And what's going to happen? What happens if Houston, Phoenix, the places within range of those Cuban missiles, Washington, Miami, name 20 good-sized cities. You're talking about millions of people with no warning. absolutely no warning. That was serious business. Kennedy got a good look at what could have gone wrong. And of course, Kennedy had as good first-hand war experience as anybody out there. As he used to say, the Japanese sunk my boat. He worked the rest of World War II for better and safer P-boats, but he was not a warrior in that sense. And after the missile crisis, when the intelligence estimates come in and he sees, we've got 1,000 missiles ready to go and we got 500 bombers on the runway, and the Russians have less than 1/10 of that, he knew. This has been a massive con job. There's no Cold War. And the missiles that we traded for in Turkey were supposed to have been removed months before. And when that became an issue, he looked at the Pentagon and he said, what are these guys doing? Who's in charge here? And he started moving away from the warlike footing. And he and Khrushchev started exchanging very personal and what were very pastoral letters. Not even speaking to issues, but just the beauty of nature, the wonders of the world, if it were not to be polluted. They just went back and forth, and they came to a mutual understanding that it's not our job, and it certainly wasn't the Soviets' job to blow up the world. But the people in the Pentagon wanted to go nuclear at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The group called XCOM, the Executive Committee. The room where they met, all of those meetings were tape recorded. And sometimes Kennedy just walked out and said, what are you people talking about? Bombing Cuba off the map. Come on. There's innocent people. And of course the tape went on running, and he heard what the Joint Chiefs had to say. And he didn't like what he heard. And one of those guys was honored on a postage stamp a couple of years ago, for, I guess, blowing up the world stamp collection. Arleigh Burke is the guy's name. He was the flag admiral. And once the dust settled from that, Kennedy just did a reversal and said, we can end the Cold War. We can save a heck of a lot of money because we don't need to spend the kind of money we do on armaments. That is still true 50 years later. There's other things that can be done with our resources. The American University speech of June 10th was, in a lot of people's eyes, the last straw. He just came right out and said, America is going to lead by example. We're not going to lead by muscle. And that made the muscle people extremely upset. The last straw on Kennedy's side of the ledger was when he lost his little boy in August of '63. In my own situation, the point where I came to when I was editing and indexing that part of the chronology, it took me one day to get through the life of Patrick Bouvier Kennedy, and it was very difficult. It really was. I could literally feel John Kennedy's pain, Mrs. Kennedy's pain, Clint Hill's pain, taking care of Mrs. Kennedy. Just unimaginable. Unimaginable. At that point, he said, it's about the children. The test ban treaty was signed because he didn't want fallout. Underground nuclear test is one thing, but an above-ground nuclear test is another matter altogether. And at that point, just for future reference, the story always is that Lyndon Johnson convinced Earl Warren to head the Presidential Commission, because if he didn't, facts could come out that would lead to 39 or 40 million people getting killed in a nuclear war. And the reality is it would have been about 1.5 billion people. If we launch on the Russians, and of course we would have had to, the fallout would have killed the subcontinent of India, China, Japan, Indonesia, populations like we can't imagine. But Kennedy was aware of all of that, and he started drawing it in. And he said to the Russians, let's have a joint space program, save money. And what stopped it was two things. One, the assassination, and two, the Russian scientists were not really eager to get involved in that because they knew they didn't have technology that we had. And they knew that they were never going to get to that point. So things are all going in one direction. And it's a direction that the Pentagon really was not particularly excited about. And out of that grew the movement to remove Kennedy. And that's the lead up. And then it was just a matter of compartmentalizing it so that it could be done without being obvious about it. You and I have talked about the suspects. Well, the mob did it, the driver did it, the CIA. CIA's failures vastly outnumber their successes. At the end of the day, I'm convinced that the military did it for a number of reasons. One, to keep themselves going. Two, to vastly improve their opportunities. Because if we're going to bring the troops home from Vietnam, that's bad news for the military. That's horrible news. I always cite the example of Custer's last stand. Custer died a colonel in 1876. 13 years earlier, when he was in his 20s, he was a general in the Civil War. But when the military was retrenched after the Civil War, you didn't need that many generals. And they just bumped people down. And
peace is bad for the war business.
Oh, absolutely. Peace is not good for business. And it's not good for military contractors who are only too happy to grease legislative palms. But if the president isn't going to sign the bill, the lobbyists aren't going to leave the bundles of cash on the doorstep. But there were, and you could literally put the number in the thousands. There were thousands of second lieutenants, first lieutenants, captains, majors, could imagine that if Vietnam were to become a war, the first lieutenant was probably going to wind up a major. The captain might wind up a one-star general. The colonel certainly would become general. And this was an opportunity not to be missed, because we've always had to have an enemy. Fascism, communism. Now they've gone one better and made it an invisible enemy, and it's terrorism. Whether it's somebody from Iraq or Timothy McVeigh, it's still the unseen enemy. And because of that, 8 billion people have taken off their shoes in an airport. But Vietnam was the opportunity with no questions asked. Because America doesn't lose wars. The contractors were salivating. People in the Pentagon were as eager as they could possibly be. And the president wanted no part of it. There's one question remaining. Would the vice president go for it? Lyndon Johnson was very hawkish in the ex-com meetings when Kennedy was not there, all on the side of the generals. For the most part, Lyndon Johnson probably didn't say 100 words at all of the meetings he was present with in groups with Kennedy for the entire time he was vice president. He sat there silent. When Kennedy wasn't there, he let his identity be known. So now you literally, somebody has given the go-ahead. Because we know if the vice president becomes president, the war will go.
1,000 Americans a month will get slaughtered?
Yeah. Some of my friends, people I still think about. Bad as as horrible as, for instance, Verdun and the Somme offensive were in World War I, and as horrible as Stalingrad or the fall of Berlin, Vietnam was a nightmare. It was just a different kind of nightmare. You didn't know who the enemy was, but you killed the water buffalo anyhow. Just this absolute senseless slaughter. We lost 58,000, we killed 1 million and lost. How does that work? The generals got what they wanted, but the privates and the corporals and the sergeants, they didn't want it as bad as the generals did. As they said in Oliver Stone's movie, the circle is tightening around Kennedy. He's got all kinds of unseen enemies. And they're powerful people. They're people that have enough corporate strength. Yesterday, perfect timing. The corporations stalled Chuck Hagel yesterday. Former Republican senator, arguably the best guy imaginable to run the Pentagon. They don't want that. They want somebody that's going to just sign checks. They don't want somebody that's going to ask questions about whether it's right or wrong. And Chuck Hagel, in his own way, is a microcosm of Kennedy in terms of accountability and, you know, the most bang for the buck. And is it right? So certainly by the time Kennedy lost his son in October, when he went ahead with the National Security Action Memorandum 263, which was going to begin the withdrawal from Vietnam, the forces had gathered. To get ahead of the story, what happens when it happens? What's Johnson going to do? What's Hoover going to do? The head of the Secret Service is meaningless. He's a functionary. Hoover hated Kennedy. Johnson hated Kennedy. I've always said, turn the situation around. Imagine that Lyndon Johnson was the President of the United States, John Kennedy was Vice President, and in a motorcade through Boston, Massachusetts, Lyndon Johnson was killed. John Kennedy becomes President. In those conditions, I would guarantee there would be an investigation under every rock in Massachusetts until they knew the whole story. But instead, the event happens in the home of the Vice President, who happens to be a different Vice President, Texas, Johnson. The killer was convicted before the sun set. No investigations were conducted. And there are instances where Dallas police officers got time off so that they could moonlight and drive the news people around to get their stories. Not only were they not investigating, they weren't even showing up for work. I mean, first of all, November 22nd was a normal work day in Dallas, Texas. If you were off that day, it was your day off. If you wanted to call in sick, you called in sick. The entire security, such as it was done by the traffic division. They're not trained to watch for killers. They're guys that blow whistles and stop traffic. That was it. There was no extra manpower put on. There were no detectives on the motorcade route. There were a few detectives at the Trade Mart. So there's nothing happening there. It's easily predictable that Hoover is not going to do anything of a serious nature, because to do so would have been pleasing to Robert Kennedy, and he wasn't going to about to do anything pleasing to Robert Kennedy. And Hoover wanted Kennedy out of there because it was his job. Hoover would have been out of power if Kennedy had been reelected. Hoover was born January 1st of 1895, and mandatory retirement was 70. There's plenty of places you can read that Hoover would have had to retire on January 1st, 1965, and it's wrong. The law was you had to retire on the last day of the month in which you turned 70. So he would have retired on January 29th, which was the last Friday of January 69. Hoover, he was a power unto himself. The FBI building was called the seat of government. And of course there have been stories about Hoover and Clyde Tolson. And towards the end, Tolson said to Hoover one time, you know, would you mind if I had a burial plot arranged to be near you? And Hoover said, don't trouble yourself. I'm only going to be needing mine for 3 days. And of course, there's Johnson. You know, is Johnson going to push an investigation? And even if there'd been a suspicion that he would have, if you make it happen in Texas, you can't. Because it's going to turn up too much stuff that nobody wants revealed. The sub-government of the United States on November 21st was the Texas Taliban. The Secretary of the Navy had been Fred Korth, who had been the attorney when Marguerite Oswald essentially lost the divorce settlement to her third husband. He was the husband's attorney, and then he became Secretary of the Navy. And he was connected to the banks that made the loans for the TFX, which was going bad in Texas. Roswell Gilpatrick was Deputy Secretary of Defense. He was connected to those banks and those loans. And one of the Warren Commission senior attorneys became president of General Dynamics, which was the TFX. And meanwhile, he's investigating the murder of the guy that would have pulled the plug on the project. So they had to know that the pieces were in place, and the Texas trip was ideal. When you posit all of that stuff, then you have to say to yourself, if what I'm saying has any validity, and I'll admit this, people they'll say, it's exaggerated. I don't believe it is. I think it's understated. But if you're going to put all of those situations in place, are you going to leave the actual event to Lee Oswald? I mean, here's the guy that was lousy with a gun when he had a good gun in the Marines. And that's factual testimony. He had no rifle practice, and marksmanship is one sport where you got to practice, practice, and practice. You walk away for 2 weeks, you lose your edge. And we could spend an hour talking about why he couldn't have done it. Not didn't do it, couldn't have done it. So the military moves in. In Oliver Stone's movie, one of the things that was said was the military always has a presence on the ground when the president travels, but they didn't for the Kennedy trip to Dallas. Well, they did.
They did, yeah.
They did, but it was a different kind of presence. The first real overt act came from Michael Payne, Ruth Payne's husband, and a friend of his, a co-worker. They got a hold of somebody named J.D. Wilmuth. Wilmuth spoke Russian, and he contacted Ruth Payne and said, I understand you have a woman that speaks Russian living with you. She said, yes, I do. And she said, I'm learning Russian. He said, I'd love to hear what somebody sounds like who's lived in Archangel, where Marina was born. Can I come by? And she said, sure. Well, J.D. Wilmuth showed up at the Payne house with Ruth and Marina and the kids on November 19th. We'll get back to him. On November 22nd, the car in front of Curry's car, Jesse Curry's was the third car in the motorcade, Kennedy was fourth. There's a car that goes through 2 miles ahead of everybody. And it was driven by the traffic division captain, Purdue Lawrence. He's got to make sure that every corner is covered. The numbers of people for a motorcade, as long as it was, a given cop had to stop traffic at this corner, then run, get on his motorcycle, take the back roads 2 miles ahead, and stop traffic when he got there, ahead of the motorcade. And that was what's called the pilot car. The car 250 yards ahead of Curry was the advance car. And that had 2 Dallas detectives, plus Deputy Chief Lumpkin, George Lumpkin, and a man named George Whitmire. It's Whitmire is his last name. And their job is to make sure everything is absolutely finalized. Everything is just as it should be. And of course, the people that were on the triple underpass should never have been there, against every imaginable Secret Service regulation. Because too much can go wrong. Even if unintended, too much can go wrong. And that car made its way through the motorcade route. It only stopped once, at the corner of Elm and Houston Street, on the left-hand side, opposite the Sexton building, which housed the company called the Texas School Book Depository Company. Mm-hmm. They stopped. They briefly had an exchange with one person standing on a corner, and then they went on. And because they lost time talking to this guy, they didn't stop and get those people off the triple underpass, which was just as well because they were a necessary distraction. The guy standing on a corner took a number of photographs, and there was a reason he was at that corner to take photographs. His name was Jim Powell. Later that afternoon, the Dallas cops and the Dallas County Sheriff, and Dallas County Sheriff's, his responsibilities are any law enforcement infractions outside of city limits. They don't operate within city limits, which is why he didn't have any of his sheriff's deputies involved in the motorcade. They were all standing on Main Street at the corner of Houston when the shots were fired, and they all ran around the corner and followed the crowd up to the grassy knoll. It's not like everybody that ran thought the shots came from the grassy knoll. The first few did, and everybody followed them. Mm-hmm. When the cops brought Marina and Ruth Payne in for interrogation, a man named Jack Crichton said, listen, I'll get somebody to translate. And he called somebody named Ilya Mamontov to translate Marina Oswald's Russian. And everything that was said Ruth Payne in the room. That's, in essence, where the story ends, except there was a presence, a sizable presence, in Dealey Plaza. And the proof is a guy named Robert Croft. He was a missionary, 20-year-old missionary, who had been doing missionary work, that's what missionaries do, in Arkansas. And he was going home to Colorado by train. And the train stopped at noon in Dallas. And he said, well, I got an hour to kill. I'll take some pictures. And when he walked out of Union Station, which is 3 blocks south of Dealey Plaza, he saw a crowd of people. What's going on? Oh, Kennedy's here. Oh, fantastic. He goes running over. He took pictures during the shooting. And he believed his 4th picture was taken just at the time Kennedy was shot. Just at the was shot in the head. And he looked at his watch and, oh my God, I got to get my train. He went running back, got on the train, went to Denver, Colorado. The FBI found him the next morning at 10 o'clock. How do you do that? Nobody is that good. The only way that could have happened is somebody that was in Dealey Plaza saw this guy take off running. He was followed. Somebody got on a train with him, followed him all the way to Denver, and then called the local office and said, you want to talk to this guy? You were taking pictures yesterday when the president was shot. Oh, how do you know that? Well,
we know everything.
We're paid investigators. It's our job to know that. And he surrendered his film, and he got back a couple of the pictures that he took, but he didn't get them all back. That's key, too. Now, who are all these people? Go back to the beginning. J.D. Wilmuth. He was a colonel in Army intelligence. He had served in the Moscow legation, obviously in Moscow, as early as 1944, doing intelligence activities in Russia. Totally, absolutely beyond question, fluent in Russian, had a PhD in Russian, taught Russian at a local university, no doubt to help generate spies or whatever. His job was to go to Marina and Ruth and simply say, listen, the sky is going to fall this week. Get used to it. Either go along with what happens or you're taking your chances. So he was there paying a courtesy call to the two of them. Because of all people on God's green earth, he's the last guy that needed to listen to what somebody sounded like from Archangel. He could tell you all the different dialects. That was his job. He knew. He didn't have to be there, except he was on a mission. The two people I mentioned in the front seat of the car, Lumpkin and Whitmire, they were the co-directors of the Army intelligence that would have been in a protective scenario had there been one. One of them is the deputy chief of Dallas Police. The other one is just simply East Sector co-commander. Mm-hmm. So Army intelligence was there, in a sense, not to be there. James Powell, the guy they stopped and talked to on the corner, was at that corner out of a 10 or 12 mile motorcade route. So people don't realize, if you take Love Field and imagine that's 12 o'clock, the Trade Mart was 10 o'clock. But the motorcade essentially went from 12 past 1, 2, 3, 4 all the way around to 10. To go back, they only had to go from 10 to 12. And for what it's worth, you cannot find motorcade assignments of traffic officers to get Kennedy back to Love Field. The only assignments were made were to get him to the Trade Mart. To me, they weren't planning on a second ride of Kennedy in the car. The guy on the corner, James Powell.
Wow, that's a pretty big one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The guy in the corner, James Powell, was a special agent in Army intelligence. His job, more than anything else, was to make sure that he saw Oswald in the window. Then they knew the patsy was in place. We got the guy that we want where we want him. Because Oswald went 15 miles out to the Payne residence on Thursday night. if he had gotten sick, or if his driver, Wesley Frazier, had gotten a flu overnight, or if Wesley Frazier's 1953 Chevy had broken down, what would have happened? No Oswald, no Patsy. But they had to know, not only was he there, but that he was in place. That was Powell's job. And then Powell took pictures of the south face of the book depository immediately after the shooting was all done. The two most famous pictures of that wall, one was taken by Tom Dillard, who was in one of the camera cars, because a guy named Bob Jackson said, I think I see a gun up there. And Jackson didn't have any film left in his camera. It's the end of the motorcade. And Dillard did. He took a Dillard picture, and it was similar to Powell's picture. And of course, Dillard's picture got overheated in the processing, and it came out a little warped. But there's no Powell could not have been allowed to take a picture with somebody in the window with a gun, because it wouldn't have been Oswald. And then later on in the afternoon, you get, I said, a guy named Jack Crichton. He gets a hold of Ilya Mamontoff. Jack Crichton was Army intelligence. So the Dallas police didn't wind up getting the translator. Army intelligence supplied the translator, and Mamontoff was connected to elements of Army intelligence, and the suspicion is, you can't prove it, but the suspicion is that his translations were more injurious to Lee Oswald from Marina than what her actual words were. I used to do sarcasm, comedy, whatever, and I'd say, just imagine Marina being questioned. How did your husband treat you? And then the Russian translator asks, Marina, when you and Lee played dominoes, what happened? And Marina's answer is, he beat me. And it comes out very negative, because the question doesn't match the answer. You know, Marina, how would you categorize your husband with a rifle? And the translator says to Marina, what can you buy for $2 in Jack Ruby's bar? She answers, a good shot. So those things fall into place. Now, Jack Crichton has an extremely colored reputation. After the assassination, he was one of, literally, the Texas Taliban that ran for office to take over the state of Texas. George H.W. Bush ran for office that year. The mayor, the Dallas mayor who was in the motorcade, who, by the way, was a ceremonial figure. The city manager was the guy that managed Dallas. He wasn't even around. Crichton, Bush, and Cabell, the brother of the CIA guy fired, they all ran for office in '64, and the two biggies lost. But Crichton, his history was that he had been in a partnership, a sponsored partnership, with George de Mohrenschildt, and that's a very familiar name in the Oswald story. In the late 1950s, he and de Mohrenschildt tried to buy oil leases that would have covered literally half of the land area of Cuba. Now that's a serious bunch of money, and that's big oil. When Crichton failed to get elected in the fall of '64, he got a position, an executive position, literally his own oil company, and the only person he was accountable to in that business was somebody named D.H. Byrd, who was a big oil person in Texas. And D.H. Byrd just happened to own the Texas School Book Depository building. And when the sniper's window was removed from that building, that window was a venerated shrine at D.H. Byrd's house until he died in 1986. And then it was put back in a glass case in the depository. But make no mistake, that was a triumph. So Crichton, he's wrong from top to bottom. Mamontoff goes back and gets big-time work in oil geology. And then the same day, the Texas authorities go look at who knows anything about Lee Oswald. They said, Army Intelligence has a file on him. Well, Army Intelligence had a file on Henry Lee Oswald, who lived at 605 Elsbeth Street, which was just knocked down, by the way, that building. Oswald lived at 602, and of course he wasn't Henry Lee. And the story was, and it was just accepted for what it was as stated, they had a file, the Army Intelligence had a file on Oswald, but the file was destroyed while it was being thermofaxed. Now, if you break that story down into its components, it doesn't ride. I don't know if you can remember or your listeners can remember, but in the old days, when you thermofax something, it meant at your end, you put one piece of paper into a cylinder, and the thing spun, which was connected to a phone line. And at the other end, they had to take the phone and stick it into a machine, and the thing would generate an image at the other end. It was like long-distance Xerox, or, prehensile fax machine. Mm-hmm. But the file was destroyed while being thermofaxed. Well, that's nonsense, because you only send one page at a time. It's not like they put 48 pages in the machine and cooked them. But they bought it. Oh, well, yeah, the file was destroyed by being thermofaxed. That's like just, jotting off Lee Oswald was fluent in Russian. He wasn't fluent in English. But if you say it casually enough, yeah, the file was destroyed while being thermofaxed. The last phone call, people kept asking Oswald, do you have an attorney? Well, I want to reach John Apt. And what Lee Oswald was thinking about, I have no idea. Because you couldn't have picked a worse attorney. I mean, he defended every communist that ever got in trouble in the United States. Oswald might as well have had a bullseye sewn onto his shirt when he wanted John Apt. But he was allowed to make phone calls. And the last phone call he attempted to make was to a number in North Carolina. And the operator that put the call through told Oswald, who of course is calling from a cell or a cell block area, the party isn't answering. And they had two men in suits listening in, and there was a second operator. The second operator signed an affidavit that the call was never even put through. But Oswald was told, the party isn't answering. The calls went to a guy named John Hurt in North Carolina, who was a big shot in Army intelligence. That's a hell of a coincidence. I mean, if I'm Lee Oswald and I'm an ex-Marine and I'm upset about my discharge, why would I call somebody in Army intelligence? Call somebody around the corner that's a lawyer. But I think Oswald started to realize nobody was going to come riding to his rescue.
That's right.
And he was set up. That's why when a cop came running, when a cop pulls over a guy walking along the street as a possible suspect for presidential assassination, that's set up well in advance. The last guy you're gonna roust is somebody walking along with his hands in his pockets. But they did, and what happened happened. Then fast forward, who's the ultimate bad guy on the ground for the Warren Commission? And not Warren or Dulles, because they were figureheads. Who's the bad guy on the ground? All inspector. Where'd he come from? Army intelligence. The circle is complete. Pause for commercial.
You're listening to The Russell Scott Show.
Dr. Walt Brown, welcome back to the program.
Oh, good afternoon.
Dr. Walt Brown is the world's leading expert in the field of JFK assassination research. He is the author of 6 books on the subject, including Treachery in Dallas, The Warren Mission, and his 30,000-plus page chronology of the JFK assassination. For today, I want to cover the well-known JFK conspiracy theories. And my favorite, did the driver shoot Kennedy?
There's no way to prove a negative to a certainty. You can't prove he didn't, but the short version is he didn't. That story started floating in the 1970s. And then a guy named Milton Cooper took it up, and he went all over the country doing the dog and pony show with that and flying saucers. He showed the Zapruder film and pointed out in one frame what looks like a flash. It's a reflection of the sun off Roy Kellerman's forehead. Anybody that's watched the film, the driver never takes his hands off the wheel. The guy's not Annie Oakley. If he had done it, he would have had to fire through Connolly. The one thing that people always point out about the Zapruder film is, well, he goes backward and to the left because you see the impact on the front right. And the driver is off to the left. It's the same story about, well, the car stopped. The motorcade stopped. The follow-up car stopped. It's human nature. If you're driving an automobile, if you look into the back seat of that automobile, you're going to reach for the brake. I don't know anybody alive turns over his shoulder to see what's going on in the back seat and hammers the gas pedal. So the car did slow down, but it didn't stop. The driver of the car could not, by Secret Service rules, accelerate until he was told to do so by a superior officer. When Kellerman said, "Get out of here, we're hit," then he was authorized to hit the gas pedal. Of course, the car weighed 7,500 pounds with armor plating underneath and 1,000 pounds of people in it. It's going to take a little while to burn up the highway. Bill Greer was just devastated by the whole thing. He drove Kennedy all day except from the hospital to the airplane. But from the airplane to Bethesda, he was the driver. From Bethesda back to the White House, he was the driver. And I think he did some driving as far as the funeral was related. Later on, when Mrs. Kennedy was out of the public eye, he characterized Greer's reflexes as not unlike those of Maud Shaw, who was the nanny to Carolyn and John Jr. But those guys weren't trained. I can't imagine Bill Greer ever having fired a gun. He had no reason to. Because driver agents were not trained the same way as regular protective agents were. And there were several driver agents on duty in Dallas because they were so short of manpower. If there's a conspiracy theory anywhere, it's there. It said it was a 5-city trip in 2 days, which means you've got guys shuttling everywhere. They got to be at the Trade Mart at 8 in the morning while Kennedy's still in Fort Worth. The group that leaves Kennedy at 8 in the morning, when Kennedy gives a speech and has the breakfast, they're already flying to Austin. And they're in Austin, asleep, when the assassination happened. The other Secret Service story that the follow-up car, George Hickey, fired the AR-15. I don't know if you were going to get into that one. He was a driver agent also, so he wasn't trained the way the field agents were, protective agents. And the guy sitting on the opposite side on top of him was Glenn Bennett, and he was from the protective research section. He was an accountant. And that's where the protection was that day. Which is to say there wasn't much.
Speaking of protection, the Mafia, La Cosa Nostra, did they have Kennedy whacked?
I don't think so. If they did, that theory is tenable. I would want anybody to tell me the second most important person that they ever had killed. Because it'd be some local sheriff or the mayor of some town that ran the prostitutes out. You just don't kill a president of the United States. In the movie JFK, Kevin Costner says, assassinations require payrolls. The mob had the money for it. They had the means, the motive, the opportunity. Bottom line was they didn't need to do it. If somebody else was going to do it. Were they upset with Bobby Kennedy? To a degree. He was solving part of their problem by downsizing the small fish. But he did get a couple of the big names kind of rattled. He had Marcello deported. I mean, they dumped him in Guatemala in the clothes he'd been wearing when they took him off the street. John Kennedy got mob money run his campaign. You can't put any kind of chain of people together. And again, if they did, who's the second most important person that the mob ever killed? If you're going to kill a president, you got to take at least credit for a couple of popes, some senators, somebody.
Jimmy Hoffa didn't happen until quite a bit later. Yeah.
75.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's just down the road from me, according to one theory, buried under Giant Stadium. New Jersey is the epicenter of the mob. The Sopranos was 10 miles from here. I mean, that's just mob central.
So if it was the mob, you'd know about it.
I wrote a story one time, and I said, I didn't think the mob did it. I said, but if they were going to do it, they would have done it differently. I think I shared this with you when we were talking one time, off the air. They're going to do it. God help them if they fail. And immediately that rules out Lee Oswald. You're going to have a half a dozen professionals from all angles. You're not going to invest in Lee Oswald with a $12 gun that was war surplus junk. I always figured if the mob was going to do it, they would have had a a utility truck parked under the triple underpass, maybe on Tuesday. And they would have, just closed off one lane, packed the underneath of the triple underpass with high explosive. When the car got 10 feet away, somebody on the corner of Main and Houston would have flicked a switch. Boom. The car would have been incinerated. They would have succeeded in what they wanted to do, removing the president. But there would have been sympathy for Jackie, for the governor of Texas, for the Secret Service agents that were killed, and it would have diminished the assassination. As I said in that story that I wrote, the kill switch would have been mailed to Joe Kennedy Sr.
Do you think it's fair to call the assassination a false flag event?
It's hard to say. It's hard to say. Simply because clearly it's reality-based. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't like somebody's gun went off by mistake and the president was killed. He was killed. There was a multi-billion-dollar war, claimed over 1 million lives, as a result of his being killed, as a direct result of his being killed. So there's
Gulf of Tonkin.
Yeah, which is
That's
not
probably
the
more the false flag event, but in tandem with the JFK assassination.
We've been plagued in American history by boats. The American Revolution came about because of the Boston Tea Party throwing the stuff off the boats. The War of 1812 was impressment. Civil War started when we sent boats into Fort Sumter. The Spanish-American War started with Remember the Maine. World War I started with the sinking of too many ships. And World War II was Pearl Harbor.
9/11 was a plane.
But yes, it was. It was 2 planes. I think it was 2 planes. Fetzer thinks otherwise.
Well, Fetzer thinks it was video fakery.
Image fakery. But the best-selling fiction book in the United States on 9/11, New York Times #1 bestseller, book called Valhalla Rising by Clive Cussler.
Mm-hmm.
And in that story, there was a plot among people in the Arab nations to fill 2 oil tankers chock full of high explosives, get them as close to the New Jersey shoreline as you could, and then run them as fast as you could right into the base of the World Trade Center, which was right on the water. And that was the bestseller on 9/11. It came true, but it turned out to be planes. It just means it was more technological.
Mm-hmm. The late, great Gaddafi, he said Israel did it. I tie that in because I know a lot of people like to think that the Mossad may have had some play on 9/11.
Yeah, and Kennedy as well.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Gaddafi believed that the Mossad was behind the JFK hit due to nuclear anti-proliferation.
The best videos of 9/11 were made by Israeli intelligence. They were on the scene, ready to shoot. But they weren't the only people that knew what was going on 9/11. The stock market was fully prepared for it. There were people saying, don't fly. It was not a deep secret. The Kennedy assassination...
Well, then how does the president himself not know, if it's not a secret? You think the president might have been told by someone. Psst.
If he didn't read the intelligence report that he was given in August, then he's negligent. But the intelligence report clearly said something was coming.
Well, then let me ask you this, Walt. Do you think Kennedy knew that there was a chance he was going to get assassinated that day?
He knew he was going into Dallas, and he knew what it meant. Kennedy had always been a riverboat gambler, and he always, rolled the dice and took his chances, and that's what he did on November 22nd, and he lost. He'd been talking about it for a couple of days with people around him, saying, somebody wanted to kill me. All I got to do is get high up in a building with a rifle, or be willing to trade their life for mine. Go running out of the crowd with 2 hand grenades in their pocket and jump in the back seat, and explosion and kill everybody. Do I think he had an awareness of what was possible? Absolutely. He went in there to beat them at their own game. To me, the proof of that is the speech that he did not live to deliver at the trademark was in your face to Dallas and in your face to right-wing extremism and hatred. It was a sharp rebuke to the kind of Dallas politics that were prevalent. That's critical. And I've always said John Kennedy was his own profile in courage. Unfortunately, the last profile of John Kennedy that you really see is Zapruder Frame 313. The fact that it would militate against it was that Jackie was sitting next to him. Would he have taken her someplace where he was at risk? I don't know that he would. When he released his son to the Secret Service agent, Bob Foster, the day before, he said, "Mr. Foster, take care of John." And Foster, for a time, believed that there was a finality to his statement. As for the Mossad being involved, I don't think they could take the risk. But
I know they're a common scapegoat.
Oh, yeah.
Mossadniks did it, you know.
If the mob or Mossad had tried that and failed, Israel wouldn't exist today. Because if the United States ever walked away from Israel, forget it. Sure, Israel's got nuclear weapons, but the Arabs don't care.
8 million a day, I think, in aid from the United States. They're
It's
well
more
taken care of.
It's more than just aid. We're Big Brother. We're standing not behind them. We're standing in front of them. Well, the USS Liberty event. I don't know
Yes,
if you're
I'm
aware.
aware of that.
And that's everything you need to know. You know, the United States was setting up Arab nations to get hit with nuclear weapons because the United States was attacked. And of course, we were attacked by Israeli jets that were unmarked. A couple dozen Americans were killed. That was in June of 67. It wouldn't have been noticed in June of 68 because that's when Bobby Kennedy was killed. Here we are in the United States today on March 1st with the sequester. There's talk of 750,000 people losing their jobs. Whether it's true or not, I don't know. But the second news item last night was that we've decided to give millions in aid to Syrian rebels. There's something wrong with one of those two news items.
There's a lot wrong with what's going on, Walt. Egypt, Libya, Syria, Iraq, Iran, it's all tied in.
Well, it'll be different when I'm king.
I don't know how you're going to be king when I'm emperor. The KGB, of course, that would have been a far more popular theory, I imagine, in the 60s.
Yeah. Komitet Gososardzvenoye Bezopasnosti. KGB. Or in Russia, they say KGB. No, not a one chance in 1,000. Kennedy was Khrushchev's savior. By turning down the volume on the Cold War the way he did, he saved Khrushchev. I could never see that. The Soviet Union ultimately went bust when it did in '89 because they bankrupted themselves trying vainly to compete in some form of arms race. They couldn't do it because they're an agricultural nation. The United States is an industrial nation. An agricultural nation can never keep up with an industrial nation. Although, credit where credit is due, the KGB was a far more efficient killing machine than anything in modern times. And certainly were better at what they did than the CIA ever was. The CIA is just a front for all the intelligence agencies. KGB was very efficient at what they did. But for them to take Kennedy out of the picture and replace him with a known hawk like Johnson, that does not serve their interest at all. The other thing that you have to stir into the equation somehow is that the Vietnam War was fought against a backdrop of, and I'm going to call them rules, that were never published. You know, the United States could bomb this place or that place or this place or that place, but we couldn't bomb this other place or this other place. We could have bombed the dams in Hanoi, put Hanoi out of business for good, but we couldn't because that was one of the rules. Yet there were...
The business of war.
Yeah, there were millions and millions of tons of bombs, carpet bombs, just, on the peasants just for the sheer hell of it. But certain bombing targets to win the war, that was against the rules. And of course the rules were, again, not made public. We didn't have WikiLeaks in those days.
This is why Cole and Powell quit the military, because their goal in any one war is not to win it. There's no exit strategy.
No.
It's all about how long can we be there, what are we going to make on it?
Yep, and that's what you and I spoke about the last time. A lot of captains were looking ahead to Vietnam and thinking, imagining themselves being called colonel. Exit strategies went out the window after World War II. It was still in Korea, and that's 60 years after it ended. When there's an American football game on, they'll always make a mention of American service personnel, who are serving abroad in 175 countries. What do we need service people for in 175 countries? Well, some of them are embassy guards and that kind of thing. But we got too many people in too many places.
On June 4th, 1963, President Kennedy signed an order that gave authority to the Secretary of the Treasury to issue silver certificates. The order, known as Executive Order 11110, was intended to serve as an interim measure while the government attempted to reduce the amount of silver being used to mint coins. The Federal Reserve killed Kennedy. Any credence to that?
Coincidentally, that became a blip on the radar the same year as the federal income tax was created by a constitutional amendment.
It was 1913 on Jekyll Island that the...
Yeah. Because income tax had been ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, so they needed a constitutional amendment to make it obviously constitutional.
Because you couldn't tax a man's labor, yeah.
The Federal Reserve Board is an incredible financial engine. They broker all of the money into the economy. They do it for a negligible amount, like 17 cents on $100,000. You say, well, peanuts, yeah. And every day they turn over $178 billion or something like that. So there's money involved. But there's a lot of confusion. The silver certificates, it was a stopgap measure and it didn't work. Because silver certificates were being issued long before the order you talked about, June 4th. And they were redeemable. It says they're redeemable, in silver. There wasn't enough silver. Because they were basically paying out silver dollars. And they were down to the last few million. And coin collectors or coin dealers were going into banks and getting hundreds and hundreds of $1 bills and turning them in to get silver dollars. And if they got 1,000 silver dollars and 10 of them were really valuable, they made a killing. So there was a run on the silver. Then they started printing what were called United States notes. Now everything today is Federal Reserve notes, but they printed United States notes, which Lincoln had done as a stopgap measure at the time of the Civil War. Paper money was never particularly trusted. It's still wallpaper today.
You're telling me that the last person that tried to do what Kennedy did was Lincoln?
Yeah, and he was, what happened to him?
Do you not find that particularly interesting? I mean...
Oh, it's unavoidable. I mean, you can't walk around that one. One of the corollaries to the Federal Reserve did it is that these U.S. notes were printed in denominations of $2 bills, $5 bills, and $100 bills. And in 1963, the only way you saw a $100 bill was if you tripped over a millionaire. Now you go grocery shopping, you take a couple of them with you. But back then, when I was a kid in 1963, if somebody had a $20 bill, it was, wow. And they were 2s, 5s, and 100s. And they did not stop printing them until 1971. So the story that Kennedy was killed and they disappeared, not correct.
Yeah, I've seen them in the auctions.
Oh, I get a bunch of them. Yeah, I mean, they're worth face value. My bank, I tell them, anytime you get old money, pre-Bush money, the stuff that Bush put out there to me is monopoly money. If you get pre-Bush money, save it for me. Why did I said, I want people to think I came from old money. And they had $930 today, just this morning. $500 of which was brand new, uncirculated, consecutive digits, $10 bills. Like they were printed yesterday, series, 1991 or something like, brand new.
They're talking about, or Obama's talking about getting rid of the penny.
They cost 7 cents to make them.
Listen, if somebody told me 6 years ago that Obama would leave you penniless, I wouldn't have argued with him.
I know there was a story, and this is, again, off the track, there was a story that some government vehicle was delivering a cartload of pennies to a Federal Reserve Bank, and it went off the road down into a ditch, and they had to account for like $57 million in pennies, out of a swamp. They probably spent $5.7 million cleaning the swamp out to get the damn pennies.
They just sent 10 guys. They just started rolling them there.
And magnets.
Can you pick up copper with a magnet?
I don't know. I've never tried. Don't try this at home. I think eventually we'll go to all paper currency.
Oh, really? I think the other way around. In Canada, we eliminated the $1 and the $2 bill and went to the loonie and the toonie. And then, of course, we've eliminated the penny. And I'm thinking it's just a matter of time before we see the $5 coin and the $10 coin.
One of the raging issues for the 1800s in the United States was hard money versus paper money.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and going back to William Jennings Bryan, you know, crucified on a cross of gold. You know, paper money, it's easier. I mean, I'd hate to have to go someplace and try to buy a Mercedes with bags of quarters.
But if the quarters had true value in terms of their...
yeah, which they don't.
No, they don't. Not now, they certainly don't. But if they were silver quarters and they had an actual intrinsic silver value, you'd prefer the quarter.
Sure. Absolutely. It's why gold is selling for $1,600, $1,700 an ounce. Mm-hmm. There's nothing you can do with it. You're not going to make a building out of gold because it's too soft. It's too malleable. But for some reason, some mystic reason, it always maintains value.
Well, it's truly rare. It is a rare mineral.
Yeah. The Russians bought up 853 metric tons of it in the last 3 years. They're trying to, you know, get into the gold business. They're 8th in the world now in gold ownership. That meteor that hit Russia in the recent days was the size of a bus, but it weighed 7,000 tons. So they're set for metals for a while. Bus, 7,000 tons.
Hey, I got a question. Did Lee Harvey Oswald shoot Kennedy?
No.
Was he ever looking down the barrel of a gun at John F. Kennedy?
At John F. Kennedy, I don't believe so.
So how could the patsy have been in place?
He had to think, you know, and again, this goes back to his sophomore romance with the TV show I Led 3 Lives, which I'm trying to update script-wise for some of my friends. I call it I Dread 3 Wives. He was somehow, and this assumes that there's only one of them, because the looks that there were 2 of them are convincing. But he was somehow conned into believing that he was the super patriot. He was the patriot. And part of the proof of that is he got away with going to Russia, telling the people in the American embassy, I'm going to give the Russians American military secrets. He went on the radio in Russia and blasted America. And then he decided to come home, and we paid his way and didn't handcuff him when he got off the boat. So somebody convinced him he had patriotism in his blood, and down the road, wait and see. First of all, could he do it? No. Marksmanship is not like playing softball. First warm day in April, you pick up a bat, you're going to hit the ball. If you go from September to the first warm day in April with a weapon, you're not going to hit a small target at a distance.
Well, how far away was the gun from Kennedy?
Well, at the time of the headshot, it was 265.7 feet. The gun itself was war surplus junk. They were cannibalized. An importer bought the lot of weapons and paid by the pound, not even by the gun, by the pound. And then they took a stock here, a trigger guard over here, and just cannibalized them and put them together. Oswald's alleged weapon, and I have one of the things, and believe me when I say it's junk, was rebarreled from 7.65 millimeters to 6.5, and that was because the United States had produced the ammunition for the Mannlicher Carcano weapons during World War II, and I've checked in books, and Italy was on the other side. They were not our ally. But we were making the bullets that they were firing. Luckily, they weren't hitting anybody. Oswald was physically handicapped. He'd had a mastoid operation when he was 6 years old. It's a procedure where they remove some of the bone, in his case, his left ear. Your balance is in your ears. And Oswald was unable to do certain mechanical things that people routinely could do. He couldn't drive a car.
Listen, I'm just going to pause you there. You're the shadow government or whomever is behind all of this, and you're setting Oswald up to be the patsy.
Right.
How is it that you fuck up and you don't notice this particular problem? This man couldn't have shot a gun because he had no balance. I mean, I guess the patsy could never be perfect, but... It's
assumed that 24-year-olds drive cars. It's
it's part of the rite of passage. When you said, let me interrupt you, I was about to say, how many 24-year-old healthy males were unable to drive cars on November 22nd, 1963? I mean, on November 22nd, 1963, I was counting the days until I could get my driver's license. And it was 283 days till I could drive. Yeah, 283, 284, till I could drive at age 17 in New Jersey. And it was that way with everybody. If you went home for Christmas vacation from school, you came back, 117 days to go. Everybody drove. And this plays into the second Oswald story, because in Russia, people don't drive at 17, 18. They don't have the means. And back then, they certainly didn't. But Oswald, he got fired from the photography job that he worked on because he couldn't make the photographs the size he was supposed to make them. And that involved a little physical dexterity. He couldn't do it. They fired him. It was costing them too much money and work that had to be redone. The gun itself is junk. The ammunition is questionable because it's years and years old. Whether it's got a full pop, you don't know. And huge factor, often overlooked, supposedly Oswald took a package to the book depository that morning. Only one person saw the package go in the door. And it was a smallish package, which would have meant that the gun was disassembled. If Oswald had to assemble that gun in the book depository, it would by no means be remotely accurate, because a weapon has to be sighted in. It's like bracketing a mortar. You fire a shot, you say, okay, I had the target lined up, but the bullet was high into the right. You adjust the sight a little bit. Take another one. It's still a little high into the right. Take another one. Most hunters will tell you it takes 10 to 12 shots to sight in a rifle to make it accurate. If anybody tells me that Oswald just went up there, built the gun, stuck it out the window, and 2 kill shots at 265 feet, that's not going to happen.
Do you think your average American hunter would have made that shot?
Not with that gun.
So
with
for someone to have made that shot with that gun, they would have had to have been a professional.
I'm not convinced a professional could do it. And the reason I say that, and I have a leg up slightly in this department, the FBI ran tests in the spring of '64. They built a tower 2 stories high, which is not the same as a 6th floor window, and they put targets at the equated distances when they believed the 3 shots were fired. They took 3 master experts, master weapons experts. They could take all the time they wanted to aim and fire the first shot, and then they had to work the bolt, fire a second one, work the bolt, fire a third one. The results were mixed. Some of them couldn't do it in the time that the Zapruder film clock would allow. Some of them couldn't hit all 3 targets, in the time allowed. One of those 3 experts, my weapons officer when I worked for the Justice Department. And this guy was as good as anybody that ever picked up a gun. He could be wearing 2 6-guns, pull them out of his pocket at the same time, shoot both ears off a flea, and not otherwise hurt the flea. This guy was good. And the FBI bench fired the Manlike Carcano, which means you put it in a vise, like you'd use in your workshop. That gun cannot move, and you sight it at a target. And at 15 yards, with that gun bench viced, it was high and to the right, by a good 6-8 inches. At 15 yards. Now you transpose that to 265 feet, you could have missed by 20 feet. But the Warren Commission said that the high end to the right was an advantage because the car was going down and to the left.
So he...
Don't ask me.
Yeah. So he was aiming... Sense. Yeah, okay, I don't even get into that.
I can't make any sense out of it. A good shot. And I earned a master expert rating with a gun. A good shot. A guy that practices 200 rounds a day with a quality weapon, properly benched. They said, well, we saw the cartons in the book depository window where the gun was resting, and you could see the creases. If a box creases, that's not something you want to fire off. You want to fire off a windowsill or a bunch of bricks that are mortared in place that aren't going to move. An expert marksman with a quality weapon could have made the shot. There's no question about that. But somebody that hadn't shot a gun in 4.5 years, with a crummy gun that he assembled himself there and wasn't sighted in, with questionable ammunition, not a chance. Not a chance. Well, the chance is, if you shoot the gun up in the air, sure, the bullet's going to come down. That's about all you can say. But to make 2 accurate shots, not going to happen. Getting back to Oswald, he was told some kind of fairy tale, and he bought into it. I suspect there were others that had been sold the same fairy tale. It was not Kennedy. Something was going to happen on November 22nd. It was going to shake up the whole world. I think it was going to be Cuba. And hypothetically, if someone had fired a shot in Dealey Plaza and had fired the shot out into the lawn, where it was off limits that day, the people that were out in the lawn were there because they had Gene Hill, Mary Mormon, they had friends who were cops. There was not supposed to be anybody out there in that lawn. It was off limits. Fire a shot out into the lawn. Secret Service jumps all over Kennedy, protects him. Quick, get him to the airport. Get him to the LBJ Ranch, because there's another barrage of Secret Service agents there. Just get him out of harm's way. He's down in Texas. The cabinet, for the most part, is in Japan. Bobby's in Washington. He's surrounded by the Texas madmen. And lo and behold, a gun is found that traces to a guy named Alec Heidel, who was a Cuban pro-Castro fanatic. Mr. Kennedy, come on, you don't get mad, you get even. This is personal. This was going to make an orphan out of your children. Let's go get Cuba. And I think Oswald and a number of people bought into that fairy tale. And they got a wake-up call when they heard the sirens and people running into the depositories. And the president's been shot.
I wonder how long it took him to know. I've been set up. I'm a patsy.
Not long. Not long. And of course, a critical clue is, what did he do after that? He walked out of the depository and got on a bus going into traffic. An assassin is going to have at least some manner of escape plan.
Yeah.
Or he's going to have some way to draw attention away. And I said to myself, if I'm in that corner, 6th floor corner window, and I fired a shot, so what am I going to do? I'm going to grab the brass, I'm going to run up to the roof, I'm going to throw them as far north as I can, because there's nobody there. It's an empty parking lot. Then I'm going to go to the front of the building and yell, he's right down here, he's right down there, and have the whole world chasing after some phantom that is God knows where in the building. But he had no exit strategy, no escape plan. The bus stops, so he gets out and he goes to get a taxi cab. But ultimately, and he has the cab drop him off 6 blocks from where he was renting a room. Why 6 blocks? He was afraid of an ambush. He knew something was up. And of course, the housekeeper where he was staying, while Oswald was in there changing clothes, says, yeah, police car pulled up outside and honked the horn. And of course, that could not be believed. You couldn't put that story out in the water. See, she thought it was car number 207 or 107, but that car had been sold. So she's wrong. Now, that's the equivalent of saying, if you try to call me, but you dial and get a wrong number, that the telephone was never invented. It's an absurd proposition. Just because she couldn't remember the number of the car, it means there was no car out there, no one cops in it honking the horn when Oswald was getting changed. Mm-hmm. And Tippett drove literally right to his death at 1:14:30. All of these people were thinking about something else happening, and the world just, as Tippett's behavior was bizarre from 12:30 onward. And he was parked at 5:01 at the final stop where Oswald would have gotten off the bus that he had gotten on by the depository. When that bus came, stopped, the door opened, Oswald didn't get out, Tippett panicked. He went ripping through town, pulled some guy over, just looked him over, didn't do anything, didn't ask license registration. Then they went into a record store. God knows why there's a crowd in there, but there was people in there. Brushed them aside, used the house phone to make a phone call, which most likely was not answered. If it was answered, Tippett didn't say a word, put the phone down, got in his car, and drove and got killed. And there's just dynamics there that are too strange to say, well, anything can happen. Something was going on. Something was going on. Jack Ruby's reaction. I killed Oswald so Mrs. Kennedy wouldn't have to come for a trial. Why would she have to come for a trial? The autopsy would prove he was dead. She didn't know where the shots came from. She didn't know who fired them.
Well, why did Jack Ruby shoot Oswald? I mean, he died in prison, if I recall.
A free man. He died in Parkland Hospital on January 3rd of 1967 from a sudden case of cancer. He was dead less than a month after the world learned that he had cancer. But his trial verdict had been overturned. He was a free man when he died. The retrial hadn't even gotten off the ground. And he was the 7th person to die in Parkland Hospital in 1967. So his tissue samples were labeled 007. Goodbye, Mr. Bond. There are theories about what happened to Ruby. He was given a routine physical, but they left him in the room with the X-ray machine on. That'll kill you. You'll die of cancer. Ask anybody that lived within a mile of Chernobyl. Ruby is one of the toughest people to figure out. He's literally a triangle whose 3 angles add up to more than 180 degrees. For all of his profession of his love for Kennedy, he didn't go near the parade. And he was only 3 blocks away. But he was deeply in debt. He owed the Internal Revenue Service $44,000, and he owed business partners in excess of $20,000. Matter of fact, the money was in his car when he shot Oswald, or on his person. It came to a couple of grand. It was immediately seized by the Internal Revenue Service. His family didn't get it, and they took the dog to the pound. One of his exotic dancers got the dog out of the pound.
So let's put this together. Jack Ruby's a nightclub operator. He's deeply in debt. I mean, he owes a lot of money.
Yep.
He's approached...
Loves Kennedy, but doesn't go to the motorcade.
No, he doesn't care about Kennedy, but he's offered a bunch of money. We can solve your problems. Kill the patsy. And then he's double-crossed.
Well,
maybe he was granted some sort of asylum. Listen, in a few years we'll let you out.
He was double-crossed in the sense that he didn't understand the law.
He thought it was okay to kill the assassin of the president.
No. I mean, if you get in a fist fight with somebody, and for whatever reason the guy takes a tumble down the stairs and he's killed, you're looking at manslaughter. It's going to bring 5 years. On the other hand, if you're shining your gun, sitting at the bar one night and saying, I'm going to go kill Smitty, and you go and do it, that's premeditated murder. And you can get the needle. Now, in those days, it was 3,000 volts. Ruby is thinking, if I just pull my gun out and rush the guy, they're going to think, I went momentarily berserk. I'll sit in jail for 3 years, and then I will have the ultimate nightclub. But what he didn't know is in Texas law, when you reach into your pocket for the gun, you are then planning to kill somebody. You are premeditating it. They tried him for first-degree murder, and he was convicted, and then it was overturned. But I don't think he had any idea. The trick is figuring out 2 things, timing and how he got in. Because he sent a telegram at 11:17 a.m. on Sunday morning, and the Warren Commission went through interview after interview to prove that the clock in every Western Union office is absolutely synchronized with the United States National Atomic Clock at the Naval Observatory in Washington, and that the Dallas Police Department clock is also synchronized. So at 11:17, he sends a telegram. 4 minutes later, he drops a hammer on Oswald, about 350 feet away. If his goal had been to kill Oswald, he couldn't take the risk that Oswald would have been moved 1 minute before he got there. And if he was going to kill Oswald, he would have done it Friday night, when Oswald was marched through the halls for that TV appearance. Because Friday night, America was still... Any American you could find would have personally strangled Oswald that Friday night. By Sunday, we'd settle back into, okay, the American system of justice is going to take its course, and then Ruby shows up. At the end of the day, it was Ruby's bullet that brought about the Warren Commission and all the noise, because Americans, whoa,
this stinks. Yeah.
One guy kills the president, and then he gets rubbed out by a strip joint owner who's in debt. Something wrong here. We want to know what's going on.
If anything, that's perhaps the biggest evidence against the fact that it's a conspiracy, because it's too obvious.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's the purloined letter. You hide something in plain sight. Geez, I don't know where that stolen automobile is. Could you look behind that red sports car and see if there's one in the garage? When something is as obvious,
Wow,
and Air Force One, they were all talking conspiracy coming home. The Secret Service was talking about it. You know, people in the back on the plane on the way home. Kennedy's secretary.
Was Oswald on that list?
No, he was an unknown defector at that point. You know, Lyndon Johnson. I don't know if she had the Federal Reserve or Mossad, but she certainly would have had a couple of mafia figures in mind. Maybe she didn't know the names, but she knew general disposition of them. And she probably would have included...
Explain the Marilyn Monroe connection. Is there one? Was that a wake-up call? We can get to you.
Yeah, that I strongly think would have been a wake-up call. Was there a connection? Yeah. I'm not convinced there was a connection to Bobby. You know, John Kennedy, his attitude was, hey, you live the way you want to live, and if somebody wants to complain about it, they're only going to do it after you're dead, and then it doesn't matter. That was his stated attitude. He had quite a collection of celebrities, you know, notched on his belt. I'm not convinced that Bobby was as guilty with Marilyn as he was. We might have talked about this at some point. Marilyn, her apartment was being surveilled. There was a yellow Corvette seen in the neighborhood regularly. And that car was also related to a break-in at Judith Exner's place. She's another Kennedy acquaintance, to be kind. They ran the license plate, and the plate tracked back to somebody named I.B. Hale in Texas. But I.B. Hale was the head of security at a large oil company in Texas, and it was his two sons that were, you know, doing what was going on, doing the surveillance, doing the bag job on Exner's apartment. And one of those boys had eloped with Connolly's daughter in 1959. And not long after they eloped, she was found dead with a shotgun wound to the head. He told the story that, well, you know, I came home and she was despondent. She had the gun to her head, and I tried to wrestle it away from her, and the gun went off, and we're all sorry about it. And he walked out of the coroner's inquest with no questions asked, because you know, his father had grease. And Hale, the father, had been an FBI agent, and he had been instrumental in creating the FBI SWAT team. So there's all kinds of connections. But was she the horse's head? You betcha. Who better? If the mob got Kennedy, and the question is who's number two, if not Marilyn, then who's number two? It drops off tremendously to the point where it wouldn't be noticed. 2.5 months before she died, she's got that gown on in Madison Square Garden singing this sultry happy birthday to him.
When did they kill Sonny Liston?
Yeah, because he didn't get to old age. I think he was in his 30s when he died.
He died not too long after Cassius Clay beat him for the second time.
Yeah, he didn't get off the mat, and that was a mistake. Liston was a prison thug. I thought he was, you know, a precursor of Mike Tyson. But Clay was unstoppable. But who could be closer than Marilyn linked to Kennedy? I mean, the mob could have killed half a dozen Sonny Listons, and that wouldn't necessarily be a message to the president. Marilyn's another story.
Tell me quickly about the chronology, and of course you're going to be back on the show. We're going to do part 3. Your 31,000-plus page chronology, I believe it's going to be finished finally this year.
Yes, it has to be.
I mean, since I've known you, you've done 10,000 pages.
Yeah, I'm indexing the last 4,500 pages now, and it's something nobody would want to do. It's broken up into 4 books, for want of a better name. The first one is Dynasty, and that goes from the first Kennedy that came to America until November 22nd. And it traces Kennedys in politics, Kennedys in business, liquor, whatever, John Kennedy's political career, you know, the failure to censure McCarthy, whatever. And then book 2 is November 22nd, November 23rd, November 24th. And the first one is Dynasty. The second one is Death. The third one is Disappointment, and that's November 25th forward to the end of the Warren Commission, when everything was thrown under the rug. And then the last book is called Discovery, which is when hopefully people like myself try to roll up their sleeves and get to a whole lot more of what really happened than the official investigations ever did. And then there are 15 appendices where specific areas are spotlighted so you can get the whole thing all at once. In other words, all the Cuban-related testimony is one appendices. Marina Oswald's Changing Stories Over the Years is another one. The collected works of John Kennedy. His speeches, the critical ones, is the first appendix. And that one, of course, ends with the speech he didn't give at the trademark. I like to think of the whole thing as the history of the last 150 years being a lake, and the Kennedy assassination is the pebble that hits the middle of the lake and just rotates outward. It brings in all kinds of other world events that relate to what happened to Kennedy or what happened in politics. One of the appendices is called The Assassination Parables, and it's 300 and some odd pages of famous assassinations. The conclusions, 97% of them are conspiracies. 96% of them, the victim is a whole lot older than the conspirator pegged for the killing, that kind of thing. The most common age of the victim is 46, which is how old Kennedy was. It's not complete. I would never want your audience to think they're getting everything that exists. And I'm hopeful that within 3 years or so, some younger person is willing to come along and pick it up and continue it and add to it, for maybe another 20 years. Because that's what it would take. I mean, I've been at this thing every day for 8 years. And when I mean every day, I mean every day. I've taken 4 vacations for a week, and 2 of them were working vacations. If you line up enough ducks, you really know what the pond looks like. To say the FBI didn't get it done because it's not enough. You have to look at what did the FBI do. Well, here's something. And over the course of 2,000 pages, you realize, oh, they really missed the boat. How many things actually happened at 12:30 p.m. Central Time in Dallas? All manner of things. It took me 3 weeks to index that minute because this person saw something, this person saw something, so-and-so heard something. Incredible numbers of perceptions. The most important thing, it marries the most significant bunch of data ever put in one place at one time. And it marries that to serious analysis. And at the same time, it's entertaining without being irreverent to John Kennedy. I'm hopeful that people I know make donations so that I can just mail 1,000 of them to universities and libraries in the hope that 50 years from now, the world will know that there was a race of people that cared about this. Wow. Because that's been the whole thing I've done. I'm driving home from shopping before, and I'm listening to Simon and Garfunkel. I say, yeah, they left behind this body of music. It's incredible. What am I leaving behind? Altogether, about 40,000 pages of what I consider really good work on John Kennedy. That's my legacy. It's no kids, nothing.
That's your baby.
It's it.
Walt, it's always an honor. It's always a pleasure.
Oh, Russ, I always enjoy because you bring out the best.
It's been a hell of a show. We're going to do another one. The audience very much appreciates them.
I'm glad for each and every one of them that still care.
It's an honor. Thank you, Walt Brown, for being on the program.
Oh, Russ, you're more than welcome. Take care, buddy.
Dr. Walt Brown, welcome back to the program.
Oh, it's good to be back. Always is, Russ.
Dr. Walt Brown is the world's foremost expert on JFK assassination research. He is the author of several books, including Treachery in Dallas, The People vs. Lee Harvey Oswald, and The Warren Mission. His newest, the 30,000-plus page Master Chronology of JFK Assassination, is now available in a 20-part Kindle edition on Amazon. Walt, the chronology is the result of over 7.5 years' research, again just released. How has the chronology been received?
It's actually the work of 30 years of research, but it was 7.5 years to put it together. It has been extremely well received. As a matter of fact, a week ago today, the introductory part was the #1 bestseller worldwide in political biographies. And believe me, that's exciting. Even if the ranking changes every day for one day in my life, I was the #1 bestseller. And that's very heartwarming. And the reviews have been outstanding. When people buy it, they'll say, now that you bought it, when you finish reading it, please write a review. And I've gotten emails. One person has already gone through the whole thing. And that's nothing short of amazing. The beauty is it'll take time. There's 4 books and 15 appendices. So people will read, hopefully, in order, the first book, and they'll be just drawn into, wow, this John Kennedy was a man who was doing incredible things, but those incredible things didn't overlap necessarily with the military, intelligence, industrial agenda. And then book 2 covers November 22nd, 23rd, and 24th, and that speaks for itself. They're all D's: dynasty, death. Then the third book is disappointment, which is the investigation, to the point where it stopped being an investigation. And then book 4 is discovery, which is the research community's input, 1964 to early this year. And it notes comings and goings, when somebody passed away, where they fit in the story. It's as complete as I can make it. And the data form, I'm going to say, a 3-dimensional jigsaw puzzle: length, width, and height. The analysis of the data is what puts the colors on the pieces, so they link together. I'm very proud of that. I really think I nailed it. And in a lot of cases, it debunks certain things that have been promoted. In other cases, it points a finger saying, this is important, follow this. See what else this leads to. It looks critically at the Ruby and Oswald and who knows who evidence. There's a couple of hypotheses, including, and I think you and I spoke about this once before, a different look at the body alteration concept. It's everything you can put between 2 covers, or if you print it out, 62 volumes.
What was your preconceived conclusion going in?
I didn't have one. The idea that I had going in was, what we need to do is put all of the data, as much as we can put, in one place, and document it. Say, this came from Warren Commission testimony of so-and-so on such and, since it's chronology, it would say, for instance, March 9th, 1964, Washington, D.C., 10 a.m. time approximate, Eastern Standard Time, testimony of Clint Hill, William Greer, Roy Kellerman, and Rufus Youngblood. There'd be snippets from Hill, from all of them. Each time there was a quote, it would be, volume such and such, page so-and-so, and there would be analysis. Little things come up that you don't realize. The driver was slow to hit the gas pedal. Part of that was because he couldn't hit the gas pedal until he was told to do so. Driver could not take evasive action until he was ordered to take evasive action. When you realize that there's a sound that went pop, that a lot of people thought was a firecracker, by the time the mind processes that as a shot, the person giving the order, Roy Kellerman, looks in the back seat, sees something wrong, and says, "Get out of here, we're hit." That takes several seconds, and we're only talking about 6 seconds. And then the car, of course, weighed 7,900 pounds and had 1,000 pounds of people in it. It's not going to do a runway takeoff like an airplane. There's 1,000 or more of those little things that people just are not aware of, that certainly at the end of the day will create a whole new set of perceptions about what happened.
Let's begin with one of the big ones then. Did Oswald shoot Kennedy, and was there a second gunman?
I don't think Oswald did anything except allow himself to be foolishly set up as a patsy. And in that sense, there had to be somebody else. In my view, it wasn't Oswald. And the reason for that breaks down to 4 components, 4 and a half. Oswald had trouble keeping jobs because he had no mechanical aptitude. He couldn't drive an automobile. At age 24, I'm going to say maybe 1% of the American population of males age 24 didn't drive automobiles because that was coming of age. That was a rite of passage. Oswald couldn't get the hang of driving a car. But in terms of marksmanship, the Marine colonel that testified before the Warren Commission was asked to characterize Oswald's skills with a rifle. And he said, quote, a rather poor shot. Now that's extremely significant because the Warren Commission makes him out to be the world's greatest sniper. Point two is the FBI fingerprint expert at the FBI laboratory, Sebastian Latona, went over the rifle with high-intensity magnification and couldn't find a smudge of a fingerprint. And the Warren Commission said, how is it he couldn't find anything? And his answer was, it's a cheap old gun. So you're putting somebody who is a rather poor shot, and you're giving him a cheap old gun, which is not going to win you a Cupid doll at the state fair. Thirdly, Oswald was last known to have fired a rifle on May 6th of 1959 in the Marines, and he scored a 191. And if he had gotten a 189, they would have sent him home as unfit for combat. So he made the cut by 1 point. There's Marine testimony saying when a guy shot absolutely lousy, they'd say, okay, you got a 191, here you go, you're still in the Marines. A 191, and I got to back up, somebody on a lone assassin clown on TV this week said, Oswald qualified as a sharpshooter at 1 point. That's the second highest qualification in the Marines. Well, it's also the second lowest because they only have 3 qualifications. But he hadn't fired a gun that can be established on the record from May 6th of 1959 until, and the next time he's alleged to have fired, well, the Walker incident was put on him, but I don't think he did that either, November 22nd. And that's 1,651 days. And marksmanship is a skill that has to be practiced. It's not like softball where you put the bat down in September and pick it up in April and take batting practice and start hitting ground balls, and eventually you get some lift on a couple. It's regular. When I was on the pistol team in DOJ, we fired 300 rounds a week, routinely. No questions asked. Here's your boxes of bullets. Take your practice. And the gun, the rifle that supposedly did the shooting, was supposedly taken into the building in 2 pieces, the wood and the metal. And it was put together in the building. And the FBI went to great lengths to prove they could assemble the rifle using only a dime, because Oswald wasn't found with a screwdriver on his person. But that begs the question, because any hunter will tell you that before they go out to start hunting season, they have their weapon sighted in, so that the sight leads the bullet to where the sight is going. Because you can put a sight on a weapon and miss by 200 feet if the sight is not sighted in. So you've got a rather poor shot with a cheap old weapon, no rifle experience for 4.5 years, and a gun that's not sighted in. And to me, that says beyond impossible. That's taken a major league ball player who's cut from the team because he can't hit. Batting average career was 191. You give him a broken bat with a taped handle, and 5 years after the last time he swung a bat, put him in the batter's box and tell him, first 2 pitches you swing at have to go over the center field fence, because that's the equivalent of 2 shots Oswald allegedly made. And it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. People have, gone on TV, and I saw it last week. It's an easy shot to make. It's a shot that can be made by an expert with a high-quality weapon with simulation. With some practice from an elevated position at a moving target, yeah, it's a shot that can be made. But it's not a shot that a rather poor shot with a cheap old gun is going to make without having fired a gun for 4.5 years. Because my weapons officer at the DOJ was one of the 3 people the FBI took out to the simulation, where they stood on the second floor had all the time they wanted to take the first shot and then fire at 3 stationary targets. He couldn't do it. And this guy was good. Bancroft Miller. He's listed in the Warren volumes as one of the 3 shooters, and he was my weapons officer in the summer of 1969. And we talked about it. He couldn't do it. He could do it in the time Oswald supposedly had, but he couldn't do it with the accuracy. If he got the accuracy, then it took much more time. And this guy was good, believe me. He could shoot both ears off a flea and not otherwise hurt the flea. That's my take on Oswald. Was there a shot from the front or not?
Yeah, 313. What happens there? It appears that it...
Well, clearly the head goes back. I've read accounts where it goes back at 100 miles an hour. Well, Kennedy's head went back 4 inches in a half a second. And when you do all the math, it's going about 3 miles an hour. But that's neither here nor there. It did go back. Now, could it possibly go back from a shot from the back? Possibly. If it's a very, very high-angle shot right down into his head, which pulls the back of the head back and then would exit from the front. It's possible. But it's not possible that that shot would have been fired from the 6th floor window. It would have had to have been fired somewhere well south of the 6th floor window. Somewhere where they passed on Houston Street. And subliminally, the fact that who was ever in the window fired as the car is going away strongly suggests that there was backup in front of him. Because if you miss that shot, you're in serious trouble. You are in serious, as it was. Oswald didn't even live 48 hours. Well, he did, but he was shot 47 hours afterwards. Whoever and whatever was behind it had to make sure that they did what they did, that they succeeded. And you're not going to leave that all in the hands of a Lee Oswald with a Mannlicher Carcano war surplus junk rifle. And that's not going to happen. And one more thing I wanted to say, ask me about the Warren Commission a little earlier. I've said to people, turn the situation around. Imagine that President Lyndon Johnson is in a motorcade in Boston, and he's killed. And 2 cars behind him is Vice President John F. Kennedy, who becomes president. Can anybody in their right mind imagine that John Kennedy would have appointed 7 politicians to a phony Warren Commission investigation? No. John Kennedy would have left no Oliver Stone untouched till he got to the bottom of what happened in his state that made him president. Whereas Johnson rigged the balloting before the first vote was ever cast.
The great physicist Richard Feynman found that JFK's head moved forwards at the moment of impact, which tells us that the shot came from behind.
Well, it tells us he's not that great a physicist.
Well, Nobel Prize winner, the father of nanotechnology.
Yeah, there is a suspicion that the head moves slightly forward between 312 and 313 in the Zapruder frames. But there's a number of explanations for that. The most critical observation is if his head went forward, it didn't go forward more than a part of an inch. And then it went violently backwards. And violently enough that it carried his body with him. It wasn't just that his head bounced back and he remained upright. His whole body went back. I saw one, I want to call it a simulation, that showed the kind of high-angle shot that I was talking about a few minutes ago. In that simulation, it showed the bullet coming in at a high angle and coming out. It showed the bullet going into Connolly's wrist. The arrow of simulation was headed, the point of the arrow ended a couple inches, or what would have been a couple inches from Connolly's wrist. And I said, please, to myself, please show the Zapruder film right now, because Kennedy is hitting the head at Z313. In Z312, Connolly is being held by his wife, and he's looking up at the sky. By Z330, Connolly is face down in front of his wife. He got literally blown out of her arms. Now, that's not a reaction based on him hearing a bullet hit Kennedy. The cognition of a man going into shock would have taken way too long. He was shot out of her arms. And anybody that I've ever spoken to about this, I said, watch the Zapruder film, but put a piece of craft paper over the left side of the TV. Just watch Connolly. He gets hit, he falls back into Nellie's arms, and all of a sudden he's just blown forward. And that's a shot. Because the single bullet theory had the bullet going in and out of Kennedy and then into Connolly, through Connolly, and then to the top of his wrist. And the problem with that is the drawings showed that the top of his wrist was up against his chest. And I invite any listener you have to put the back of their wrist against their chest. You got to be a contortionist. And why would Connolly have been doing that in a motorcade where he's waving at people and looking for votes? Makes no sense. I'm sure over the years you've had every imaginable concern about the single bullet theory highlighted and addressed. I'd just like to add one thing to it. Again, 99% of the people that were sitting in Dallas this past weekend listening to stories aren't aware of. The House Select Committee medical panel, which included Cyril Wecht, who is, in my mind, the leading outspoken critic of Lee Oswald, so to speak. The medical panel included Cyril Wecht, and he agreed with the conclusion that a bullet entered Kennedy's back and exited through the front of Kennedy's throat. They also agreed that the bullet rose at an 11-degree angle. That's extremely critical, because as a forensic pathologist, Cyril Wecht says, what that means is for that bullet to go on and hit John Connolly, Kennedy would have had to have been shot when he was tying his shoes. And we know he wasn't. That bullet either is the one that hit the chrome on the very, very top edge of the limousine in the front, or it went out over the car and just went to infinity with a couple of bounces and wasn't found because people weren't looking 1,000 feet down the road with a metal detector. The other significant thing is that bullet, the wound in the throat, was seen by the Dallas doctors, and it was only seen by 3 or 4 of the Dallas doctors. It wasn't seen by the whole room full at one time or other, and it wasn't seen by every nurse that wheeled in and out of there, although in the last few days a couple of nurses that claimed to be there claimed they saw it for the first time ever. The Dallas doctors, Kennedy was on his back in the emergency room. The Dallas doctors looked at him and saw a small 3 to 5 millimeter hole in the front of his throat. Now, what that translates to is people immediately saying, whoa, wait a minute, Oswald's rifle was a 6.5 millimeter, so how can you have a 3 to 5 millimeter hole? You can, because skin is elastic. It'll expand with the bullet going through and it'll contract. So that's still in play, theoretically. But it was a round hole, no jagged edges, and very little blood extruding. That can only mean that that bullet exited Kennedy straight out. It certainly was not going sideways. Bullet traveling sideways that has hit something is going to make a great big hole. And this made a small hole that the Dallas doctors even said in a press conference. You know, he was shot in the throat, the bullet may have hit something in the spinal column and deviated upwards and blew out the back of his head. That was Malcolm Perry at 2:30 in the afternoon in a Parkland Hospital press conference. The significance of a small round hole is that that bullet left straight out. In 34 10-millionths of a second, John Connolly was hit in the back with a bullet going sideways. And that's impossible in the known universe. That bullet did not leave Kennedy straight and just decide to make a sideways turn. This isn't talking about a turn in terms of where is Connolly in position to Kennedy, you know, with it went this way, then it stopped, and then it turned, and then no. It left Kennedy straight, it hit Connolly sideways. That's all you need to know. That's 2 bullets. And the bullet that hit Connolly sideways by no means hit him on the top of the wrist with that wrist against his chest, because you have to be a contortionist to do it. But again, you're told so many different things. There are photographs of Arlen Specter and people involved in the recreation of the assassination, and they're using a simulated coat of Kennedy's with a chalk mark on the back. And they've got a rod that they're hypothesizing is the rod, in other words, a shot 6 inches down from his collar, out his neck, into Connolly. When the Warren report was written, that bullet wasn't 6 inches down from his collar, it was in the back of his neck. Who wrote that revision but Gerald R. Ford? And he admitted it in 1997. He publicly admitted that he moved the wound just to keep it more simple for the public to understand. Well, it also made it more simple to make it a lie.
But is this not the essence of it all, that the public needed closure and a patsy was needed?
The government needed closure for the public, in my view. And I'm being simplistic about it because I was 16 years old at the time. The public wants the truth. But at the same time, I don't think the public wanted to know that any of the, that the mob killed him, or that Johnson did it, or that the Secret Service did it. I don't think they wanted to know things like that. They wanted to feel safe in that, well, it was a lone nut, and he died 2 days later, so the Republic is safe. It's a convenient fairy tale, really. And, of course, Johnson's convenient fairy tale was, look, Justice Warren, we can't have the public thinking that Castro did it or Khrushchev did it. That's just how Johnson pronounced Khrushchev. Because that would lead to a war, and 39 or 40 million Americans would get killed. And what he leaves out is that when we fired back, 1.5 billion people would get killed, because the fallout from us hitting Russia would kill everybody in India, China, and Japan. And that's a huge number. So Earl Warren said, all right, listen, I'll make sure that it doesn't point at Castro or Khrushchev. Well, Oswald was a defector to Russia. How do you put out that fire? Oswald supposedly was this fair play for Cuba activist. How do you put out that fire? You know the way you do it? You get 100,000 spiders, and they weave a web around Oswald so that nothing penetrates it. The person inside that massive spider web is the guy that did it. Forget his politics, forget everything else. He did it. Maybe he was a communist, but that doesn't make him a Soviet agent. And it was slick. But I read the Warren volumes 6 times, from 1991 until 2 years ago. And each time I went through them, I learned a lot more, because I was able to integrate stuff I'd seen the time before it. And Malcolm Perry, before he died, he said, listen, I know what happened. I was there. And these people that say otherwise, they haven't even read the Warren volumes. Well, yeah, they have. Some have. I know I did, and I know he didn't read them 6 times. And when he testified before the commission, he had to somehow get around the story that he stood up and said, well, the bullet entered in the front of the throat, hit something in the spinal column, deviated upwards, and blew out the back of his head. And his game was that while people were firing questions at me, left and right, somebody over here might have yelled something, somebody over there might have yelled something, and my answer was, came out. I tried to answer both questions with one statement. But the statement is still not Oswald. The statement is still he was shot from the front. So Life magazine, in their, rush it out issue, says that Oswald either was shooting when the car was on Houston Street, or Kennedy turned completely around to wave to the crowd, and therefore Oswald shot him in the front of the throat. Because for a time, the Malcolm Perry story had to be believed. And then Arlen Specter says to Malcolm Perry, when you go back home, can you round up all the articles that made the statement attributed to you and correct them? And Perry said, I'd be glad to. And somebody on the commission, and it was either McCloy or Dulles, said, do you realize what you're asking this man to do? Because all of the articles would include press clippings from Tokyo, from Copenhagen, from Uruguay, you name it. It's going to be all over the world. It wasn't something that was just written up in U.S. papers. And, of course, he never did it. But the fact that it's in the record that he's going to go back and correct the mistakes that he said publicly, and again, my analysis, the first thing I'm going to say is nobody is going to go in front of TV cameras and microphones and make up a story. They are only going to say what they know to be the absolute truth. Because this is the President of the United States. They worked on him. They pronounced him dead. So to say what they said in the press conference, they got to be straight up. 6 months later, they can invent stories. Oh, I didn't mean to say it quite like that. No, if the bullet went in the front, it went in the front. Are you saying it went in the back, but you made a mistake and thought it went in the front?
81% of the witnesses at Dealey Plaza heard 3 shots.
Okay.
How many shots were fired?
I won't speculate, simply because hearing 3 doesn't mean that just 3 were fired. You have to account for the bullet that went through Kennedy. You have to account for at least 1 bullet that hit him in the head. You have to account for Connolly being hit twice. And then something, either a fragment of a bullet or a whole bullet, hit a curb and kicked some cement off of the face of James Tague. There's a guy that is out in the ozone when it comes to the assassination. He told me his story over the phone, and it's an absurdity, but I'll let you get it from him.
You have his phone number? You can pass that on to me, Walt?
I'll tell you how to do it when we get off.
All right.
When we're done. You have more than 3 shots to account for. And as you said, most of the witnesses heard 3 shots. Well, how were they spaced? Well, the first one and the second one were really close. No, well, the second and the third, it was a shot and then a long pause and then bang, bang. And I interviewed some of those people. Same frustration. The first 2 were close, the last 2 were close. It's perception. You could argue that of the witnesses that you're talking about, in terms of the 81% of those people, they weren't there to witness an assassination. They weren't there to listen for how many shots were fired. They weren't there to make estimates of what was the time frame between the first shot and the last shot. They were just part of something very sudden and very unexpected. I always wanted, at a Dallas conference, I wanted to stage a reconstruction. While somebody is speaking up at the podium, have somebody run down the aisle, fire several shots at the guy, bang, bang, bang with a cap gun or something. The guy falls over and the shooter goes out, through the curtain. And say, everybody, take out a pencil. Take out the paper and pencil you've been handed. Write down how many shots were fired, how long the whole interval took, give a description of the shooter. Tell everything you saw. And you would get so many different stories. And as I said, they weren't there to witness an assassination. They were there to be part of a parade. The groundskeeper of Dealey Plaza was a man named Emmett Hudson. He was standing on the stairs that lead up to the grassy knoll. And his perceptions are extremely bizarre. And you have to question them, because if, in fact, there was a shot from a knoll, he would be aware of it. So somehow you have to make him out to be a non-credible witness. So he was asked, from the first shot to the last shot, how long did it take? And his answer was, well, it was about 2 minutes. 2 minutes? If the story of 6 seconds in Dallas is correct, 120 seconds is off by a multiple of 20.
Time slows down in these situations.
Yes, it does. Yes, the time freezes.
Mm-hmm.
And again, perceptions. Bill Newman is cited in Oliver Stone's movie as, Kennedy's ear was shot off. It's because when that blob appeared on the right side of his head, the elastic skin expanded massively and then contracted. It would be easy to believe, yeah, his ear was shot off. Roy Kellerman's testimony in Volume 2, page 91, said that he was standing right next to the autopsy doctor, and the autopsy doctor said the entrance wound was right here, in front of the right ear, but in the hairline. If that bullet entered in front of his right ear, nobody from the sixth floor window fired it, because Kennedy's head was tilted at such an angle that no bullet from the sixth floor window could have entered at that spot. You have to go back to Z312, and no bullet could have entered there. When you look at the skull x-rays, they're a study in multiple bullets all by themselves, because there's multiple sets of radiating fractures. Commander Humes, doing the autopsy, because he was the chairman of the laboratories, he was not a forensic pathologist, he marked a spot low in the back of the head as where the bullet entered. The House Select Committee said, no, you're wrong, and you're wrong by 4 inches. And he said, I have trouble with that. But they moved the bullet wound to the top of the head. And if you look at the x-rays, there are radiating fractures from the very top of the head. And there's a little, you can even see a shelf of skull sitting above the beginning of the radiating fractures. But there's also radiating fractures at the spot that Humes talked about. And it's the same when you look at the anterior-posterior x-rays, the ones taken from the front to the back. There are radiating fracture lines in Kennedy's facial bones, and they cross. Radiating fractures cannot cross. And by that I mean, if somebody throws a rock at a window, and it creates a spider web of mess, somebody throws a rock next to it, and the crack starts to spread, it will stop at the first crack it hits. It won't cross any of their original spider webs. Can't. Radiating fractures cannot cross. Any radiologist worth his salt looking at x-rays will tell you the same thing, but yet in Kennedy's case, they cross. There's just too many unanswered questions. So the easiest answer is, well, Oswald did it. Leave it alone. It'll be like Kennedy was James Buchanan, and wait a minute, who was he? Because half of the people that were aware of what Friday was weren't even alive when November 22nd, 1963 happened.
Yeah, it's more than 50 years now. Is it still relevant?
Absolutely. It's relevant for a couple of reasons. One, the truth is always relevant. We won't have the truth until we can look at all the pictures, so to speak. You know, open the files. If there's one piece of paper locked away, that piece of paper is significant. Why is it locked away? What was going on? If you take the 50 years before November 22nd, 1963, and go back to November 22nd, 1913, hypothetically, there were a whole series of political assassinations in Europe. And the instability created by those cross-pollinated, so to speak, with the interbreeding, because the Tsar of Russia and the King of England were cousins, and they looked like the Smith brothers. You couldn't tell them apart. And the Kaiser of Germany, they're all somehow descended from Queen Victoria. Between the assassinations and the inbreeding, you had the perfect recipe for a mass slaughter. But how many people knew that fact on the day Kennedy was killed, that 50 years before is what happened? They didn't. And I put a lot of relevant history into the chronology, not just John Kennedy. I put all the American assassinations, but I also had an appendix of worldwide assassinations. And at the end of the day, when you read that appendix, you realize nothing new happened on November 22nd, 1963. Well, wait a minute. Jackie crawled out on the back to get pieces of skull. Okay. The wife of one of the Grand Dukes of Russia, after he was blown up by a bomb, tried to put his body back together. So she's out-physicianed, so to speak, Mrs. Kennedy by a whole lot. And that guy was killed in such a devastating way that his fingers were found several blocks away with imperial rings on them. That's how they knew it was from him. They were wearing rings that only belonged to the Tsar's family. So there's nothing new under the sun. And as far as lone nuts, the guy that killed Garfield, he was as crazy as anybody has ever set foot on this planet. He had a taxi hired and waiting to take him to police station after he shot Garfield. Well, of course, the cops took him. He was his own defense lawyer. He browbeat everybody on the jury, the judge, everybody in the courtroom. The guy was absolutely Looney Tunes. But his argument was, excuse me, I shot Garfield. Medical malfeasance is what caused his death, so I didn't kill him. Well, that didn't work. But it was an interesting argument. And he even composed poems that he was going to read on the gallows, and he wanted an orchestra. So he got to read the poems, but as I noted in the chronology, the orchestra, like the assassin, was left hanging.
How often do you think these lone nuts are the sole perpetrators? The Hinckleys, the John Wilkes Booths? Or do you think it's more often there's a bigger conspiracy?
John Wilkes Booth was part of a serious conspiracy. That night, somebody was supposed to kill, one of his co-plotters was supposed to kill Andrew Johnson. Somebody was supposed to kill Secretary of State Seward. The guy that was supposed to kill Johnson decided he should have a little hot toddy to calm his nerves, and he had a little too much hot toddy, so he went home inebriated, never went near Johnson, but was hanged because he was a conspirator. The guy that was supposed to kill Secretary of State Seward got into the house by saying he had medicine delivered because Seward had been in a carriage accident. Once they got a look at this guy, they said, this guy's no pharmacist. Who is he? There was a fight. The pistol that he was going to use to kill Seward, a piece of the firing mechanism, fell out in the fight. And he thought, oh, damn, I can't use the gun. He threw the gun down and he stabbed Seward. He could have used the pistol, but he would have had to cock the hammer and then pull the trigger. The piece that fell out is what brought the hammer back. He went stumbling into the boarding house, and they arrested him, and they hanged him. The guy that was waiting at the barn door with a horse for Booth to get away, they hanged him. And then they put several people in prison in the dry tortugas, and they were eventually pardoned by Andrew Johnson. But there were a number of people convicted in the Lincoln thing. Garfield and McKinley were lone nuts. The guy that shot Franz Ferdinand, which led to the outbreak of World War I, was 4 days shy of his 21st birthday, so he was too young to be executed, even though what he did led to 50 million people getting killed. So they just threw him in a dungeon, and he died of consumption before the war even ended. But he was too young to execute. But he was part of a plot. There were people at all kinds of places waiting to shoot the Grand Duke as he came through town. And the car made a bad turn, and that's how he stumbled into the assassin. Now, I don't know if I ever mentioned, there is a pre-Zapruder film from 1934 available on YouTube. And it's the assassination of Alexander I of Yugoslavia in Marseille, France. Just watch it. I'm not going to say anything more. You're going to say, my God, this is a Zapruder film. Yeah, it is. I hope your listeners take a look at it. It's Alexander I of Yugoslavia, 1934, and it's easy to find on YouTube.
We have an audience contribution here. J. Edgar Hoover stated shortly before his death that there was more than enough evidence to arrest, indict, and convict George Herbert Walker Bush as the mastermind of the assassination. Your thoughts?
Two thoughts. One, I don't know the pedigree, so to speak, of that statement. I don't think Hoover would have said it. And when you say shortly before his death, it wasn't like he knew he was dying. Even though he was 77 years old. That doesn't mean he knew he was dying. I certainly have never seen that statement either just boldly put out in a tabloid or in something where I would have to assess credibility. I don't know. I don't know. However, that said, if I had to speculate as to who was the sponsor of the event, you have named that person.
Not Lyndon Johnson.
No. Lyndon Johnson was a gutless coward. At the end of the day, he was a man who would never take a risk. When World War II broke out, he immediately got commissioned in the Navy. He went up in one airplane, and when they said that there was Japanese planes nearby, he was kneeling at the exit hatch with a parachute. He was terrified. Get this plane down. Plane landed. He was in World War II for 9 minutes. He got a Silver Star for being on that plane, but nobody else on the crew did. And then in 1958-59, a movement gathered around him because he was seen as he's a Senate Majority Leader. The guy's a power broker. He can stop Nixon. And who else is going to do it? And this is when Kennedy started going to every rubber chicken dinner imaginable to get known and to meet people out there in huskings. People like James Carville or George, fellow with the Greek name, the guys that understand the workings of politics.
Stephanopoulos?
Stephanopoulos, yes, thank you. Guys like that that are political advisors to people who go places in politics. You know, they were all over Lyndon Johnson. And they said, first thing you do is you enter the primaries. And Johnson said, nope, I'm not going in any primaries. Why not? He said, I'm not going in primaries, period. And in reading Russ Baker's book on the Bush family, Family of Secrets, talks about Johnson and Kennedy fighting it out in the primaries. And when I spoke to Russ Baker one time, I said, they didn't fight it out in the primaries. Lyndon Johnson was not in any primaries. Sure he was. No, he wasn't. He wasn't. And the other thing is Johnson refused to declare his candidacy as, I want to run for president, until the opening day of the convention. Because if he had declared his candidacy in April, there are some states in the United States that automatically put every candidate into the primaries. And Johnson did not want to be in primaries because he didn't want to lose. And this goes back to horrible things that happened in Johnson's childhood with his family. His father was a drunk, they were broke, they were living on handouts. And Johnson never really got over his upbringing. And Johnson was invited to dinners all over the country, just like Kennedy was. Kennedy went to all of them, Johnson went to none of them. He would accept, and then he'd cancel out. And it was a regular pattern. This is well documented by the more respectable of Johnson's biographers. So if somebody that tries to make Johnson out to be somebody decent comes out and says that, you have to give it credibility. And then there are probably, I'm going to say 30 moments after November 22nd in which Johnson wrote memos to his aides that he was quitting as president. He wasn't, somebody was critical of me in the paper the other day, and I'm not going to take this nonsense. I'm just going to leave here, and the vice president come on the show. I don't need this anymore. He was convinced that Jackie Kennedy was going to show up at the Atlantic City 1964 convention. And if you remember, Robert Kennedy stood there for 22 minutes of applause, trying to get the people to stop applauding. Of course, that happened after Johnson and Humphrey were nominated, so it didn't help Bobby Kennedy any. But Johnson was convinced, and he said so in phone calls, and he said so in memos, that Ms. Kennedy, as he described her, was going to show up the opening day, walk out there, get all the applause as the grieving widow, and then say Bobby Kennedy should be the next president of the United States starting in January 1965 because he would continue the job that my husband began, and there would be a stampede for Bobby Kennedy and Johnson would be out. And he wrote memos at that point in time saying, I may not even go to the convention. I don't need this. I'm not going to take this kind of nonsense. And it was constant. When Walter Jenkins got caught in the men's room of the YMCA doing whatever he was doing there, it's 2.5 weeks before the election. Johnson's, I'm going to quit. I'm not going to lose my reputation on a scandal like this. And it just repeats. And you finally get to a point on March 31st, 1968, where Johnson goes on TV and he says, I will not be the nominee of your party for the next election. I was a junior in college and I was dancing in the streets. But he expected, this is my interpretation, I'm convinced, he expected to be cajoled into staying on. He fully expected, oh, Lyndon, come on, you're all we got. You're the man. If you don't run, we're not going to win. Come on, stick around. Let us bring you back into their political arena. But what happened was when he said it, everybody said, okay, fine, move on. And they did. And I don't think he expected just everybody to walk away from him. Lyndon Johnson is a study in psychoses, and he needs to be studied. But as far as him running the show on November 22nd, I cannot imagine it. And the works that I've seen that I've seen, because I haven't read them all, and I don't intend to. When they characterize him, their characterizations are accurate. But you look at the footnotes, and they all come from Robert Caro or Dalek or Beschloss. They all come from guys that have written scholarly biographies of LBJ. The characterizations are nothing new. Then you see the allegations that Johnson micromanaged the assassination. He was the one that had the top put down on the Kennedy's car, which he didn't. He was the one that was out with the Secret Service all night, so they weren't prepared to protect the president, which he wasn't, which they weren't. He saw to it that there were no Dallas officers after Main Street. When the car turned onto Houston Street, from that point on, there was no more cops, and there were at least 15 officers. And to say that there were none because LBJ wanted it that way is nonsense. It's just nonsense. So to me, the stories don't play out. I don't think he was the mastermind.
Okay, well, let's not skirt the issue.
I think he had advanced knowledge, and I think it would not have gone forward if there hadn't been an understanding that he and Hoover were going to throw a blanket over the whole thing.
So, in your opinion, they should have been hanged for conspiracy?
Hanged, shot, take your pick. Absolutely.
So why is George Herbert Walker Bush the mastermind?
Because, to me, there had to be someone on the ground in Texas. And he comes through everywhere as the plotter and the schemer. He became the head of the CIA. He ran for office in political office in 1964. I'm sure you know the stories about Operation Zapata. That was the code name for the Bay of Pigs. And George H.W. owned Zapata Oil Company. And the two ships offshore that were supposed to deliver additional ammunition and did not were the Houston and the Barbara. That's an amazing coincidence, or a series of coincidences. He's a political schemer. He gave all kinds of, saw to it that all manner of guns and weapons were delivered to the Iranians who were holding the Americans hostage, to keep them hostage until after the election in 1980. The crisis got Jimmy Carter out, and Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush in.
Yes, and of course Reagan is famously shot too.
You mentioned Hinckley as a lone assassin. There were stories.
Are you saying that George Bush tried to do it twice?
Tried to do what twice? Shoot Reagan?
Pull off the assassination of the president.
Well, there's an assassination cluster. Hinckley, Chapman, who shot Lennon, and Oswald, whatever he did, those three guys lived in an area that you could put under a thumbtack on a map of the United States. Both Hinckley and Chapman were from the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Hinckley was from a well-respected oil company family, and there are stories, I can't confirm, but there are stories that George H.W. Bush was supposed to have dinner that night with the Hinkleys. And all of a sudden there's a shooting, and they're rushed home. You know, he's rushed back to Washington while Alexander Haig was taking credit for being in charge of the White House. Coincidence? Yeah. You know, the Hinckley family and the Bush family being friends and the kid being involved. If that bullet had been a quarter of an inch in a different position, the two world leaders would have been the former head of the CIA, George Bush, and the former head of the KGB, Yuri Andropov. And that's a scary scenario. Did Bush want to be president badly enough to do it? Or did he have motive? Sure. He wanted to be president. Did he have the means? Anybody that's got that much money has the means. Did he have the opportunity? Well, he had Hinckley. But again, I don't know enough about it. I don't deal with questions as far as the World Trade Center or UFOs because my focus is John Kennedy. And if I had to put somebody charged in Texas, in other words, the Texas overseer, it would certainly be someone with intel and corporate interests. And that would be the person we're talking about, not Lyndon Johnson. And of course, people don't realize, but Johnson, his life was dangling by a thread on November 22nd. At the time the shots were being fired, let me say that again, at the time the shots were being fired, the Senate Rules Committee was interviewing a man named Don Reynolds. He had sold Mrs. Johnson, sold Lyndon Johnson's companies, which were in her name, $88,000 worth of insurance. To do so, he had to give bribes to Lyndon Johnson. And the Senate Rules Committee really wanted to know about that. And Don Reynolds had Johnson by the shorties. 900 miles away in Chicago, the Time Life editorial board was sitting down with a dozen reporters who had been out beating the earth for a couple of months to come up with how is Lyndon Johnson a millionaire several times over when the only job he ever had was in Congress and the Senate, and he was getting paid $12,000 or $14,000 a year. And they had the goods on Lyndon Johnson and his millions. And all of a sudden, the radio announces, we interrupt this broadcast, you have a dead president. If you impeach the guy that steps into his shoes, the United States turns into Honduras. We become a banana republic. So everybody became a patriot. And they just lined up and forgot all of Lyndon Johnson's sins. So, does that put Lyndon Johnson as the prime mover? He had reason to want to become president. But again, looking at him personality-wise, in depth, I don't think he could have done it.
It meets the character profile of George Bush, much more so.
Oh, absolutely.
Much more so.
Absolutely. No hesitation. If I'm debating somebody that says Lyndon Johnson did it, I would agree with exactly what you said. He had far greater motive. But at the same time, he had far less intestinal fortitude.
Herbert Walker Bush claims he didn't remember where he was when he heard Kennedy was shot.
I read the story, and the same thing was true in a lesser detail of Richard Nixon, because Nixon was in Dallas. He was partners with a law firm that handled the Pepsi-Cola account. And the reason Kennedy's lunch was at the Trade Mart was because the Bottlers Convention had the best site. If Nixon and the Bottlers hadn't gone to Dallas, Kennedy would have gotten a better site and he wouldn't have gone through Dealey Plaza. Bush contacted the FBI. And he said, this is George H.W. Bush. And he said, I overheard conspiratorial talk today. And it involved the name of some guy. I can't think of the name right off. But it's not a name that's out there widely known. And, it wasn't David Ferry or somebody like that. It was just a name. And the FBI checked, investigated this character, whoever it was. And he said, I don't know what he's talking about. I wasn't involved in any conspiracy. I run a legitimate business, blah, blah, blah. End of story. But what that phone call did is it gave Bush an alibi. Because he's saying, well, I was in Houston having lunch, and I overheard, but who knows where he was? He just made a phone call. Nobody bothered to look and see, where was that phone call made from? Oh, a phone booth in the Texas School Book Depository. My. But he was establishing an alibi. And to me, that's instant crookery. Particularly when you put somebody on the spot and say they're conspirators, when it appears they may not have been. And I remember reading Nixon's version of it. He said something to the effect that, I heard it from my doorman at my apartment. He told me that he'd been shot. And if you know English grammar to find points, what Nixon was saying was that the doorman had been shot. Because once you put a noun there, the doorman told me he'd been shot. It means the doorman told me that he, the doorman, had been shot. It just doesn't work right, but that's English grammar, and Nixon never understood it anyhow. But he was in Dallas that morning, flew out before they closed off Love Field, and came back to New York. He flew in with Joan Crawford and a few other people, and Joan Crawford was asked about the whole thing, and she said, yeah, Kennedy was going to have a luncheon engagement that Friday, but Richard Nixon and I were not on the guest list. It was kind of a snob appeal kind of answer that she gave. If you don't know where you were when it happened, you were either in the womb or not yet there. Because everybody knows. And of course, I was in the house that I'm speaking to you from.
Of course, I wasn't alive then, but for our generation, it's like 9/11. Although, from what I understand, it has much greater impact.
Oh, absolutely. The people who were my age at the time of 9/11, I don't think they had nearly as much interest in government and politics and foreign relations and whatnot as the people that were my age on November 22nd, 63. Because my generation was the one that protested the Vietnam War, carried on, and all of what was done. 19 Saudi Arabians flew 4 planes either into the ground or into targets, depending on who and what you believe. Accordingly, we went to war against Iraq. And I said to myself, Saudi Arabians, Iraq. So I'm thinking, if there's ever a terrorist attack launched from Peru, we're going to turn around and declare war on Iceland. Weapons of mass destruction. Okay, well, in that case, we got to have a war. And right now, it's going to go on forever. It is going to go on forever. There is no exit strategy because there's no exit. And we should have learned that from the Russians in Afghanistan. It's a tragedy. I see commercials on TV to donate money to the veterans who are lost legs, lost arms, or basket cases. Government sent them over there. The government should take care of them. I didn't send them, and I wouldn't. John Kennedy's assassination was a meteor hitting in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and the waves from that meteor hitting the ocean spread all the way across the United States and all the way across Europe, North Africa, South America. It was the seminal event of the 20th century. It was the single event that changed everything in the 20th century. Not Pearl Harbor, not World War I, which certainly changed a lot. It was Dallas.
It has been called the mother of all conspiracy theories. Do you think the JFK assassination gave birth to the modern-day conspiracy theorist? And perhaps even a more paranoid American culture?
Well, to the extent that people are more paranoid in terms of accepting government pronouncements, it's a very realistic possibility. The mother of all conspiracies, I go back to the stories that say, hey, we don't really know fully how Jesus died, and that was 2,000 years ago, not 50.
We don't even know if he lived.
Yeah, or arose, but I'm not going to get into that because there's always a possibility of lightning. The Kennedy presidency was a fascination to Americans. It was just as TV was really coming of age, because when Eisenhower was president, you had a 9-inch screen with a lens on the front which made it look larger. And Eisenhower was everybody's grandfather. He was this tired old guy who played golf and ran the country, which ran itself. Then you get John Kennedy, and he's alive. And he's got a beautiful wife. He's got little kids in the White House, which Americans were not used to, because Eisenhower didn't have any little kids in the White House, and Truman had Margaret, sometimes treated by the press as a little kid, and FDR, none of them. So we weren't used to children in the White House, and Carolyn and John. I mean, they just captured the American imagination. And of course, John Kennedy, handsome, young guy, beautiful wife, wit, style, having these events at the White House, Pablo Casals. That was just a whole new ballgame. And you had the First Family album with Vaughn Meader and things like that, where you could poke gentle fun at the government. And when Kennedy says, have you heard these things and, read he said, yeah, I'm aware of what's out there, but he said, I think it sounds more like Teddy. Whereas we have had politicians in the White House that would have had a nasty answer to that question. America leaped forward. And of course we went through crises during Kennedy's presidency, the worst of which was the Cuban Missile thing, because a lot of people didn't think they'd be alive at Thanksgiving in 1962. And we got through it. And, of course, the story we got about the Cuban Missile Crisis was a little bit managed. Nobody ran to microphones in front of the White House and said, oh, by the way, we're going to take down the missiles in Turkey, which were sitting ducks anyhow. But we came through it. And then in 63, you had the American University speech, which was critical, which said, hey, there is a road to peace. And we wanted to hear that. The next day, Kennedy spoke about civil rights, and almost too coincidentally, Medgar Evers was assassinated shortly after the talk. Then you had the test ban treaty, but of course at the same time you got guys setting themselves on fire in Vietnam. It was a crazy time. And one of the things that comes through in the chronology, and this is just one example out of many, I contacted a number of people to just see what the feeling was, and I said, between November 1st of 62 and October 31st of 63, because I wanted to keep the Vietnam coup out of the story. I said, what's the most important day in the life of John Kennedy, and what's the most important day in the life of Lee Oswald? And we got a bunch of answers. But eventually there was a consensus. The most important day for John Kennedy in that time frame was the day his baby son died. And nobody should ever go through that. We know what happens. And Kennedy, according to close aides that are credible, damn near had a breakdown over that. And I suspect strongly that he never wanted to write another parent, you know, your son was killed in uniform today in a rice paddy. And eventually the consensus on Oswald was that the most important day in his life in that time period was the day he got arrested for being the victim in that leaflet event. When guys came over, roughed him up, threw the stuff up in the air and pushed him around, and he was arrested and he was convicted. But that filled out his resume. Well, the thing that comes out of that is both of those events happened the same day. Kennedy's baby died in the early hours of the morning of the day that Oswald was arrested. Now, that doesn't tell us anything about the assassination, but it drives a chronology-driven engine because you see things falling in place.
Last Friday was the 50th year anniversary of the assassination of JFK. You were on Al Jazeera that morning, Geraldo Rivera, Coast to Coast AM at 2 in the morning.
Right.
How has the media handled this 50th year anniversary?
Well, I think mishandled would be a better characterization.
Were you mishandled at Al Jazeera?
No, not by anything that I was allowed to say or do, but it was what I wasn't allowed to say or do that I consider nobody called me and said, hey, listen, you wrote this 32,000-page chronology that I can get on Kindle or Nook or whatever. Would you debate Bill Riley on television? Oh, you betcha. Make my day. But that's not going to happen. What about Bugliosi? Sure, glad to. He wrote that little book. Little book, it's 1,600 pages. Yeah, I know. It's a little book. But that wasn't going to happen. And somewhere, the media's, putting aside the places you mentioned and yourself, the media's interpretation was, this is a celebration of the canonization of Lee Oswald as the lone assassin, period, sign, die, over, done. Let's not have any more talk about that. And what it should have been was a celebration of what John Kennedy did as president and what his closest aides believed he was going to do had he lived. But there was none of that. It was just all debunking conspiracy theories. And I did that in the chronology. When I found something I didn't believe, I said, I don't believe it. And here's why. It was carefully orchestrated. Some fella came out on Thursday of last week. He was the landlord for the Oswald family when they lived in the Bronx, New York, on the Grand Concourse. And he remembers Lee Oswald shooting his BB gun out the window at people walking by. I was in the New York Times. You get down to the bottom of the article, they said, well, you know, how much contact did you really have with them? He said, I had no contact whatsoever with the Oswalds. Hey, if I'm a landlord of a building and somebody's shooting a BB gun at people out the window, I'm going to have contact with that family. But that story is all over the wires. Thursday into Friday. Oswald's guilty. Look at that. Here it was. Look what he did when he was 13. The FBI interviewed that landlord in December of 1963, and he didn't say a word about Oswald shooting BB guns out the window, and that was the time to say it. And people came out and said, you know, my dad was an FBI agent, and who knows? Who knows? I was JFK's mistress, said great-grandma so-and-so. Well, I dated somebody whose brother-in-law knew somebody up the block whose cousin had once met a guy who was flying over Texas at 30,000 feet when the assassination happened, and he knows the story, so here it is. And it's rubbish. It's just absolute rubbish. Everybody's in the CIA. just a massive disconnect between reporting and reality. It disrespects the memory of John Kennedy. If you're going to leave the conspiracy out of it, fine. Leave Lee Oswald out of it, too. Just make it John Kennedy. You want to keep the conspiracy people out? Fine. But make it John Kennedy. Because anything otherwise is disrespectful. He certainly earned the population's respect because when there are polls, I'm not talking about approval or disapproval of the warrant, polls put John Kennedy up near the top of great presidents. Where was that for the last 2.5 weeks? It wasn't there. It was a documentary about how Kennedy was killed, shot in Richmond, Virginia. Or was Bugliosi going on and on, saying nothing. And it's unfortunate. It is what it is.
Walt, where can the audience pick up your 32,000-plus page masterpiece?
Go to Amazon and look up Kindle books. Just type my name in, and you'll get all the icons for the 20 pieces, or Nook, or Apple iTunes. And if anybody has difficulty or, you know, is looking for something, have them send an email to me at K-I, as in idiot, K-I-A-S as in Sarah, K-I-A-S, JFK, at AOL.com. I'll steer them in the right direction somehow. If they have questions once they read the Kindle or anything like that, you know, write to me. I'll be glad to deal with the questions as long as they're politely asked.
And they can check out your website, deeppoliticsforum.com.
Deep Politics Quarterly, yeah.
Deeppoliticsquarterly.com.
Yeah, do a search for the JFK Deep Politics Quarterly, and that website will come up. And I have to get the fellow that does that to update it. But it's out there. It's out there, and anybody that reads just the 4 books, putting aside the appendices, anybody that reads those 4 books is going to just take a deep breath when he's done and say, wow, this is the best I've ever read. Because it's good stuff, it's good analysis, and it's entertaining. It reads like I talk to you, you know, with the wit and the sarcasm and what have you. It's the only way I can do stuff.
Walt, it's always great having you on the show.
Oh, it's always great being on. I look forward to our next visit. I respect your listeners because they're tuned into the right place, and I'd be glad at your convenience we'll do it again.
Right on. Walt, thanks once again for being on the program.
Thank you so much.